What would you do if stopping to help a stranger cost you everything you had left to lose? Luke Mercer thought he'd buried his heart 5 years ago with his wife and son. He'd sworn never to let anyone close again. But when he found four barefoot children standing over their collapsed mother on a scorched Texas road, miles from anywhere, with a dead horse and a sky full of vultures circling overhead, he made a choice that would shatter the walls he'd built around himself. This is the story of the day one broken man stopped running from his past and collided headfirst with a family running from their future. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The heat that day could kill a man if he let it. Luke Mercer had learned long ago not to let anything kill him. Not the sun that hammered down on the Texas plains like a blacksmith working iron, not the loneliness that sat in his chest like a stone, not the memories that whispered to him in the dark hours before dawn. He'd survived worse than heat. He'd survived loss that would have buried most men 6 feet under. So when his mare, Cassie, started pulling left toward the creek bed at the edge of his property line, Luke didn't fight her. The old girl knew thirst when she felt it, and he wasn't cruel enough to deny her water just because he was in a hurry to get back to the emptiness waiting for him at home. The ranch house had been empty for 5 years now, empty of laughter, empty of the small footsteps that used to race across the porch, empty of Sarah's voice calling him in for supper, her hand on his shoulder in the evening light, her breath warm against his neck in the darkness. Empty. Luke had made a peace with empty, or so he told himself every morning when he woke to silence and every night when he lay down alone. He was 42 years old and felt twice that. His hands were scarred from years of ranch work, his face weathered by wind and sun, his hair more gray than brown now. He hadn't looked at himself in a mirror in months. Didn't see the point. Cassie whinnied softly as they approached the creek, and Luke patted her neck. "Easy, girl. We'll get you." He stopped. His hand froze on the reins. There, maybe 50 yards ahead where the road curved past a stand of mesquite trees, something was wrong. At first, Luke thought it was just debris. The wind could kick up strange things out here. Tumbleweeds, fence posts torn loose in storms, even the occasional coyote carcass baking in the sun. But as Cassie moved forward, the shape resolved itself into something that made Luke's stomach tighten. A horse, dead. From the look of it, lying on its side in the middle of the road. And standing beside it, Luke's breath caught. Children. 4 of them, clustered together like frightened birds. Even from this distance, he could see they were young. Too young to be out here alone. Too young to be this far from town with nothing but a dead animal and dust for company. The oldest looked to be maybe 12 or 13, a girl with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come half undone. She was holding something in her arms. A child, Luke realized. A small boy, maybe 3 or 4 years old, his head lolling against her shoulder. Beside her stood another girl, younger, maybe 8 or 9, clutching a rag doll to her chest. She wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, just staring straight ahead with eyes that looked too big for her face. And then there was another boy, older than the toddler but younger than the girl with the braid. Maybe 6. He was barefoot. They were all barefoot, Luke noticed now. Not a shoe among them. Every instinct Luke had developed over the past 5 years told him to turn Cassie around and ride the other direction. This wasn't his problem. These weren't his children. He'd learned the hard way that caring about people, especially children, was a guaranteed path to the kind of pain he'd sworn never to feel again. But even as he thought it, even as his hands tightened on the reins to turn away, his eyes caught on something else. A woman. She was on the ground behind the children, collapsed in the dust about 10 feet from the dead horse. Her dress was torn, her hair tangled and dusty, one arm stretched out toward the children as if she'd been reaching for them when she fell. She wasn't moving. Luke sat perfectly still on Cassie's back, every muscle in his body locked in conflict. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to keep riding, maybe send word when he got back to town. Let someone else deal with this. Someone who hadn't already been broken beyond repair. But the oldest girl must have heard Cassie's hooves because she suddenly turned her head and looked straight at him. Their eyes met across the distance, and Luke saw something in her face that bypassed every wall he'd built, every vow he'd made, every defense he'd carefully constructed. It wasn't just fear. It was desperate, bone-deep terror mixed with the kind of courage that only comes when you're protecting something more important than your own life. The girl shifted the small boy in her arms. He was clearly too heavy for her, her thin arms shaking with the effort, and took one step toward Luke. Then another. She didn't run, didn't shout, just walked toward him with her chin up and her eyes locked on his, carrying her burden like she'd been carrying it for miles. When she was close enough that Luke could see the tracks of dried tears on her dust-covered face, she stopped. "Please," she said. Her voice was hoarse, cracked from thirst or crying, or both. "Please, sir. My mama, she fell. She won't wake up. And Timmy—" She looked down at the boy in her arms. "He's burning up. He needs help. We all need help." Luke opened his mouth. He meant to say no. Meant to tell her he was sorry, but there was nothing he could do, that she should wait here and he'd send help from town. But what came out instead was, "How long has she been down?" "I don't know." The girl's voice broke. "Maybe an hour, maybe more. The horse she just stopped and fell over. Mama tried to get us water from the creek back there, but she couldn't make it, and then she just dropped." Luke dismounted. His boots hit the hard-packed dirt, and he felt like he was stepping off a cliff. Up close, the children looked even worse. The oldest girl's lips were cracked and bleeding. The 6-year-old boy was swaying on his feet, his eyes glassy. The silent little girl with the doll hadn't even looked at Luke. She was staring at something in the distance, or maybe at nothing at all. And the toddler in the oldest girl's arms, Timmy she'd called him, was indeed burning with fever. Luke could see it in the flush of his cheeks, the way his small chest heaved with each breath. "What's your name?" Luke asked the girl with the braid. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Bennett. I'm Luke." He moved past her toward the woman on the ground, every step feeling like he was wading through deep water. "These your brothers and sister?" "Yes, sir. That's Timmy. And that's Samuel." She nodded toward the 6-year-old. "And Rose." The little girl with the doll still hadn't moved. Luke knelt beside the woman. Margaret Bennett, he assumed. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 35, with dark hair like her daughter's and a face that would have been pretty if it wasn't covered in dust and drawn tight with exhaustion, even in unconsciousness. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. There. Weak but steady. Relief flooded through him, surprising in its intensity. He didn't want to care whether this stranger lived or died, but apparently some part of him, some stubborn, foolish part he'd thought was dead, still did. "She's alive," he said, and heard Clara sob behind him. Margaret's skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow. Dehydration probably, and heat exhaustion. Maybe worse. He wouldn't know until he got her somewhere cool and got some water into her. Luke stood and looked around. The dead horse was definitely dead. Had been for at least a few hours from the look of it. No wagon, no supplies visible, except for a single canvas bag lying near the horse's head. Whatever these people had been traveling with, this was all that was left. The nearest town was Cedar Ridge, 8 miles east. Luke's ranch was 2 miles north. No choice, really. Not if he wanted to keep this woman alive. "Can you walk?" he asked Clara. She nodded quickly, desperately. "Yes, sir. All of us can. Well, except Timmy. But I can carry him. I've been carrying him." "No." Luke moved back to Cassie and started loosening the saddlebags. "You've carried him far enough. I'll take him. And your mother." "On the horse?" "Horse can't carry all of us. We walk." He pulled his water skin from the saddle and handed it to Clara. "You and your brother and sister share this. Small sips, not too much at once or you'll be sick." Clara took the water skin like it was made of gold, her hands trembling. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I didn't know if anyone would come. I didn't—" "Drink first. Talk later." While the children passed the water skin between them, Clara carefully helping Rose drink, then Samuel, before taking a small sip herself and not touching it again, Luke bent down and carefully lifted Margaret Bennett into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been. Too light. How long had these people been on the road? How far had they come? As soon as he lifted her, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. They were gray, he noticed. Gray like storm clouds. No, she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Put me down. I can walk. No, you can't. My children are fine. I've got them. Now be quiet and save your strength. Her eyes focused on his face for a moment, searching. Then, as if she'd seen something there that satisfied her, she stopped struggling and let her head rest against his chest. Luke settled her weight in his arms and turned to Clara. You help your little sister. Tell your brother to stay close. We've got 2 miles to walk. Can you make it? Clara's jaw set with determination that looked far too old for her young face. Yes, sir. Then let's move. They started walking. Luke led the way, carrying Margaret, with Cassie plodding along beside him. Behind him came the children, Clara holding Rose's hand, Samuel stumbling along beside them, all three following like a small, determined army. The sun beat down mercilessly. Luke's arms began to ache within the first quarter mile, but he didn't slow. Couldn't slow. Not with Margaret's breathing growing more labored and the small boy, Timmy, starting to whimper in his fever dreams where he lay draped over Luke's shoulder opposite his mother. Wait, when had he picked up Timmy too? Luke glanced back and saw Clara walking empty-handed now, one arm around Rose, the other supporting Samuel, who looked ready to collapse. The girl must have transferred her little brother to Luke's shoulder at some point. Smart kid, knew when to ask for help. How you holding up back there? Luke called. Fine, sir, Clara answered, though her voice was thin with exhaustion. 1/2 mile more. You see those trees up ahead? That's my property line. Is there water? Creek runs right through the middle of it, and a well at the house. All the water you can drink. He heard Samuel make a small sound of relief. They walked on. The sun climbed higher. Sweat ran down Luke's back, soaked through his shirt. Margaret stirred occasionally in his arms, mumbling words he couldn't make out. Timmy's fever seemed to be getting worse. The boy was shaking now despite the heat. Luke's ranch came into view just as he was starting to worry he'd have to stop and rest. The house was small, just a simple 2-story structure with a wide porch, but it had good shade and a roof that didn't leak. The barn was in decent shape. The well was solid. It was a home, or it had been, once. Almost there, Luke said, more to himself than the children. Scattered as they approached. Clucking scattered as they approached, clucking irritably. His old dog, Rufus, came limping out from the porch and barked once, then seemed to sense the urgency and fell silent, his tail wagging uncertainly. Luke climbed the porch steps, harder than it should have been with his arms full, and kicked the front door open. The house was dark and cool inside, exactly as he'd left it that morning, exactly as it had been for 5 years. Silent, still, waiting, not anymore. Clara, Luke said, there's a bedroom to the right, first door. Go open the windows and pull back the blankets. The girl hurried past him, Rose still attached to her hand like a shadow. Luke carried Margaret into the bedroom and laid her carefully on the bed he hadn't slept in since Sarah died, the bed he'd avoided for years because it hurt too much to even look at. Margaret's eyes opened again as he set her down. This time they were clearer, more focused. Where? She started. My ranch. 2 miles from where I found you. You're safe. My children. All here. All safe. Timmy. Fever. I know. I'll take care of it. Margaret tried to sit up, but Luke put a hand on her shoulder, gently but firmly. You're not going anywhere. You're dehydrated and heat sick and probably haven't eaten properly in days. You stay in this bed while I deal with your son. Understand? For a moment he thought she might argue. He could see the fight in her eyes, the stubborn pride that had probably kept her alive this long. But then her strength failed and she sank back against the pillow, her eyes closing. Don't let him die, she whispered. Please. I've already lost so much. Don't let me lose him too. Something in Luke's chest cracked. I won't. He carried Timmy to the kitchen and laid him on the table, the same table where Sarah used to knead bread, where their son had eaten his meals, where Luke now sat alone every morning and evening. The boy was burning up. Luke had seen fever like this before. If they didn't break it soon, it would kill him. Clara appeared in the doorway, Rose still clutching her hand. Samuel stood behind them, barely able to stand. Clara, Luke said, his voice sharp with command. I need you to listen carefully. Can you do that? The girl nodded. There's a creek about 100 yards behind the house. You'll see the path. I need you to take 2 buckets from the porch. You'll see them by the door, and fill them with water. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Good. And in the barn, you see that building there? There's a small room at the back. Should be some clean cloths in a basket. Bring those too. Yes, sir. Samuel, Luke turned to the boy, you sit right here and don't move. Rose, you sit next to him. Both children obeyed without question, sinking onto the bench by the table like puppets with cut strings. Clara ran. Luke had forgotten how fast children could move when they needed to. She was back in less than 10 minutes, both buckets sloshing with creek water, the cloths bundled under one arm. Good girl, Luke said, and something in Clara's face brightened despite the exhaustion and fear. He set to work. Cold water and cloths to bring down the fever. Lukewarm water, a few drops at a time, into Timmy's mouth to fight the dehydration. Luke had done this before, years ago, when his own son had fallen ill. His hands remembered the motions even though his heart had tried to forget. Timmy whimpered and cried, but Luke kept going, methodical and patient. Clara helped, following his instructions exactly, her young face set with concentration. An hour passed, then another. Slowly, painfully slowly, the fever began to break. Timmy's skin grew less hot to the touch. His breathing evened out. His eyes opened once, confused and frightened, but when Clara leaned over him and whispered, "It's okay, Timmy. You're safe now," he relaxed and drifted into what looked like real sleep rather than fever dreams. Luke sat back, his shirt soaked with sweat and creek water, his arms aching from holding the boy still. "Is he going to be okay?" Clara's voice was small, fragile. "Yeah," Luke said. "I think so." Clara burst into tears. Not quiet crying, not the kind of tears she'd probably been holding back for hours or days or however long this family had been in trouble, but real, shoulder-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and desperate. Luke didn't know what to do. He hadn't comforted a crying child in 5 years, hadn't comforted anyone. But his hand moved on its own, reaching out to pat Clara's shoulder awkwardly. "Hey, it's all right. He's going to be fine. I thought we were all going to die out there. The horse died and Mama fell and Timmy was so hot, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know." "You did exactly right. You kept your family together. You asked for help when you needed it. That takes more courage than most adults have." Clara looked up at him, her face blotchy with tears. "Really? Really?" She wiped her eyes on her sleeve, trying to pull herself together. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't. Mama always says I need to be strong for the little ones." Being strong doesn't mean not crying. Sometimes crying is the strongest thing you can do. Luke had no idea where these words were coming from. They certainly weren't things he believed about himself. But they seemed to help Clara, who took a shaky breath and nodded. "What about Mama?" she asked. "Let me check on her." Luke stood, his knees protesting after sitting on the hard floor for so long, and walked back to the bedroom. Margaret was awake. She was lying in bed, propped up on one elbow, her gray eyes fixed on the doorway, as if she'd been waiting for him. Her hair was still tangled, her face still dusty, but there was color in her cheeks now, and her gaze was sharp and clear. "My children," she said immediately. "Where are—" "Timmy's sleeping. Fever broke. Samuel and Rose are in the kitchen eating bread and drinking water. Clara's watching them." Margaret closed her eyes, and for a moment Luke thought she might cry like her daughter had. But when she opened her eyes again, they were dry, fierce. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know who you are or why you helped us, but thank you." "Luke Mercer. This is my ranch." "Margaret Bennett." She tried to sit up fully, but Luke could see the effort it cost her. "You should rest." "I've rested enough." But even as she said it, she swayed. Luke moved forward and caught her arm, steadying her. "When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning. Maybe the day before. I'm not sure." "When's the last time any of you ate?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "What does it matter? We're alive. That's what counts." "It matters because you're in my house now, and I'm not going to watch you and your children starve." "We're not staying," Margaret said sharply. "We'll rest tonight and leave in the morning." Where will you go? That's not your concern. Luke studied her. She was proud, this woman. Proud and stubborn and scared, though she was trying hard not to show it. He recognized the look. He'd seen it in his own eyes often enough. You're running from something, he said quietly. Margaret's face went very still. What makes you say that? Dead horse, no supplies, 4 children on foot in the middle of nowhere with no shoes. Nobody travels like that unless they're running. Maybe we're just poor. Maybe. But poor people don't usually look over their shoulder the way you just did when I said you were running. Margaret's hand clenched in the blanket. You don't know anything about me. No, but I know what it looks like when someone's trying to survive. I know what desperation smells like. And I know that whatever you're running from, you can't outrun it if you can barely walk. For a long moment, Margaret just stared at him. Then slowly, her shoulders sagged. His name is Victor Hale, she said quietly. He says my late husband owed him money. Says I have to pay the debt. Says if I don't... She looked toward the door, toward where her children were. He made it very clear what would happen if I didn't pay. How much? $500. Luke let out a low whistle. That was more than most people made in a year. That's a lot of money. My husband didn't owe it. I know he didn't. We were poor, but he was honest. He would never... Her voice broke. But Hale has papers, documents, and he has men, and I couldn't fight him, so we ran. How long ago? 3 weeks. We've been moving at night, hiding during the day. The horse was old. We bought her cheap in Fort Worth. She made it farther than I thought she would. And now? Margaret lifted her chin. Now we keep running. On foot? With 4 children and no supplies? If we have to. You'll die. Then we die free. The words hung in the air between them. Luke recognized that tone too, the tone of someone who'd rather die than surrender. He'd used it himself, in the dark months after Sarah and Thomas died. There's another option, he heard himself say. What? You stay here, rest, eat, get your strength back. I'll ride into town tomorrow, ask around about this Victor Hale, see if there's anything that can be done about those papers. Why would you do that? It was a fair question. Luke didn't have a good answer. Because he was tired of being alone? Because seeing children in danger had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was sealed shut forever? Because Margaret Bennett reminded him of Sarah, not in looks, but in the fierce, protective way she looked at her children, like she'd tear the world apart with her bare hands if it meant keeping them safe? Because you need help, Luke finally said, and I can give it. I don't want charity. It's not charity. It's... He searched for the right word. Neighborly. Margaret laughed, short and sharp and bitter. I haven't had a neighbor be neighborly in a very long time, Mr. Mercer. Luke. Luke. She studied his face like she was trying to read something written there. What do you get out of this? Nothing. Everyone wants something. Not everyone. They looked at each other in silence. Outside, Luke could hear Clara's voice talking softly to her siblings. The sound of water being poured. The creak of the porch boards as Rufus settled down for an afternoon nap. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. Sounds Luke hadn't heard in his house for 5 years. One night, Margaret finally said. We'll stay one night, then we go. Fair enough. Luke turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped him. Luke? He looked back. Why are you alone here? A ranch this size. Where's your family? The question hit him like a fist to the gut. For a moment, Luke couldn't breathe. They're dead, he said, his voice flat. My wife and son. Fever took them 5 years ago. Margaret's face softened. I'm sorry. So am I. He left before she could say anything else. In the kitchen, he found Clara had managed to get some food into Samuel and Rose. Both younger children looked better, less like they were about to collapse, more like they might actually survive. Rose still hadn't spoken, but she was eating bread and jam with small, methodical bites, her eyes watchful. Your mama's awake, Luke told Clara. She's asking for you. Clara jumped up immediately. Is she okay? She's weak, but she'll recover. Go see her, but don't tire her out. She needs rest. Clara nodded and hurried to the bedroom, Rose trailing behind her like a silent shadow. That left Luke alone in the kitchen with Samuel, who was looking at him with large, serious eyes. "Are you going to help us?" the boy asked. Luke crouched down so he was eye level with the child. "I'm going to try." "Mama said nobody would help us. She said we were on our own." "Your mama's been hurt. Sometimes when people are hurt, they forget that there are still good folks in the world." "Are you good folk?" It was such a simple question, such an innocent one. Luke thought about all the ways he'd failed over the past 5 years, all the times he'd turned away from other people's pain because he couldn't bear to feel anything himself, all the moments he'd chosen isolation over connection, emptiness over risk. "I'm trying to be," he said quietly. Samuel seemed to accept this answer. He took another bite of bread, chewed thoughtfully, then said, "Thank you for saving Timmy." "You're welcome." "And thank you for not leaving us on the road." Luke's throat tightened. "You're welcome." The boy went back to eating, apparently satisfied. Luke stood and walked to the window, looking out at his land. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The chickens were settling in for the night. Rufus was snoring on the porch. In the distance, cattle were moving toward the water tank. Everything looked exactly as it had this morning. But everything had changed. For the first time in 5 years, Luke's house had people in it, living, breathing people who needed him, who depended on him. It should have terrified him, should have sent him running. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long, cold sleep. That night, Luke gave Margaret the bedroom and made pallets on the floor of the main room for the children. Clara tried to insist she could sleep sitting up, that she didn't need comfort, but Luke wouldn't hear it. He found old blankets in the chest, blankets Sarah had made, blankets he hadn't been able to look at for years, and spread them out. Timmy slept in his mother's room, still recovering from the fever. The other 3 children collapsed onto their pallets like soldiers after a battle, asleep almost before their heads hit the makeshift pillows. Luke sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. He heard the bedroom door open and looked up to find Margaret standing in the doorway, wrapped in one of his old blankets. She looked steadier now, though still weak. "You should be sleeping," Luke said. "So should you." She came out onto the porch and sat down carefully on the top step, a few feet away from him. "Couldn't sleep. Keep thinking I'm going to wake up back on that road with nowhere to go." "You're not on the road anymore." "No, thanks to you." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I heard what you told Samuel about trying to be good folk." "You were listening?" "Mother's habit. We learn to hear everything." She turned to look at him. "You lost your family to fever?" Luke nodded, not trusting his voice. "How old was your son?" 4, almost 5. "The same age as Timmy." "Yeah." Margaret wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. "I lost my husband 6 months ago. Not to fever, he was killed. Accident at the mill where he worked. They said it was quick. Said he didn't suffer." Her voice was bitter. "Like that makes it better." "It doesn't." "No." She looked up at the stars. "But you keep going anyway because you have to. Because there are people depending on you. Because the world doesn't stop just because yours did." Luke knew exactly what she meant. He'd thought the same thing 1,000 times in the past 5 years. The world had kept turning even though Sarah and Thomas were gone. The sun had kept rising. The seasons had kept changing, and he'd kept breathing, kept moving, kept existing, even when he wasn't sure he wanted to. "Your children are brave," he said. "They're terrified. They can be both." Margaret smiled slightly. "I suppose that's true." Then more quietly, "Clara told me what you did for Timmy, how you saved him. She said you knew exactly what to do, like you'd done it before." Luke's hands clenched. "I told you. My son had fevers." "Did you save him?" The question was soft, but it cut deep. "No," Luke said. "I couldn't. The fever was too strong, or I didn't know enough, or maybe there was just nothing to be done. I don't know, but I tried. And when he died anyway, I buried him next to his mother, and I swore I'd never—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Never what?" Margaret asked gently. "Never let myself care about anyone again. Never put myself in a position where I could lose someone and feel that kind of pain. But you stopped for us anyway." I don't know why I did that. I do, Margaret said. You stopped because you're not as dead inside as you think you are. You stopped because some part of you still remembers what it means to be human. Luke wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he'd stopped out of simple duty or habit, or because it would have been inhuman to ride past a dying woman and 4 children. But he didn't say any of that, because maybe, just maybe, she was right. They sat together in silence, 2 broken people under a sky full of stars, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Luke didn't feel quite so alone. One night, Margaret said eventually, I said we'd stay one night. That's what you said. But maybe, she hesitated, maybe we could stay 2, just until Timmy's stronger, just until we can figure out where to go next. Luke looked at her. In the starlight, with her face turned up toward the sky, she looked young and old at the same time, young enough to still have hope, old enough to know how easily hope could be crushed. You can stay as long as you need, he said. I won't take advantage of your kindness. I know. And I'll work. I can cook, clean, help with the animals. I'm not afraid of hard work. The children, too. Clara's good with chores, and Samuel can help in the garden, and even Rose can... Margaret. She stopped. You don't have to earn your keep. You just have to rest and heal. That's all I'm asking. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Why are you doing this? Really? Luke thought about all the complicated answers he could give, about loneliness and grief and the way seeing her children had reminded him of everything he'd lost, about how his house had felt more alive in the past few hours than it had in 5 years, about how he'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. But what he said was simpler. Because you stopped on that road, he said. You collapsed trying to get water for your children. You burned yourself out trying to keep them alive. And when I found you, every ounce of strength you had left was still reaching for them. He paused. That's the kind of courage worth saving. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused from work and worry, but they were warm. Thank you, Luke Mercer, she said quietly, for seeing us, for stopping, for caring when you didn't have to. Luke squeezed her hand gently. He didn't trust himself to speak. They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, watching the night deepen around them. Inside the house, the children slept peacefully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new questions about Victor Hale and debts and danger. But tonight they were safe. And for Luke, who had spent 5 years living in the tomb of his own grief, that was more than he'd allowed himself to hope for in a very long time. When Margaret finally stood to go back inside, Luke stayed on the porch. He listened to her footsteps, heard her check on each child, heard the bedroom door close softly. Then he looked up at the stars, and, for the first time since Sarah died, he said her name out loud. Sarah. Just that. Just her name. Not a prayer, not a plea. Just an acknowledgement that she had existed, that she had mattered, that she was still part of who he was, even though she was gone. The night didn't answer. The stars kept shining. The wind kept blowing across the plains. But something in Luke's chest, something that had been locked tight for 5 years, loosened just a fraction. He'd stopped on the road today. He'd saved a woman and her children. He'd opened his door and his home to strangers. And tomorrow, he would wake up to the sound of children's voices instead of silence. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Luke thought, as he finally rose and headed inside, a beginning was enough. Luke woke to a sound he hadn't heard in 5 years. Laughter. For a moment, lying in his bedroll on the floor of what used to be his study, he thought he was dreaming. Thought he'd slipped back into one of those cruel dreams where Thomas was still alive, still running through the house with his toy horses, still filling every room with noise and joy. But then he heard Clara's voice, sharp and practical, nothing like his son's had been, saying, Samuel, you have to be quiet. Mr. Mercer is still sleeping. And a smaller voice, defiant, but I'm hungry now. Luke opened his eyes to early morning light streaming through the window. The house smelled different, not just dust and emptiness anymore. Now there was something else, the scent of people, of life happening in rooms that had been dead for too long. He sat up, his back protesting. The floor hadn't gotten any softer since he was 20. He ran a hand through his hair and stood, pulling on his boots. When he walked into the kitchen, he found Clara at the stove. His stove, which he hadn't used for anything but coffee in years, trying to figure out how to work the cast iron skillet. Rose sat at the table, her rag doll in her lap, watching her sister with those two old eyes. Samuel was perched on the counter, swinging his legs, chattering about something to do with chickens. All three children froze when they saw him. "I'm sorry," Clara said quickly, her face flushing. "I was trying to make breakfast. Mama's still sleeping, and Timmy's still weak, and I thought maybe if I could cook something, you wouldn't have to—" She stopped, looking down at the skillet in her hands. "But I don't know how to use this stove, and I couldn't find the eggs, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "Stop," Luke said gently. "You didn't do anything wrong." Clara looked up at him, uncertain. Luke crossed to the stove and took the skillet from her hands. "First thing you need to know about this stove is she runs hot. You have to watch her, or she'll burn everything you put in her." He adjusted the damper. "Second thing is, the eggs are in the coop out back. Third thing is, you never have to apologize for trying to help." "But Mama says we shouldn't impose. Your Mama's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for too long. Let someone else carry it for a while." He looked at Samuel. "You, boy, you know how to gather eggs?" Samuel nodded eagerly. "Then get a basket from the porch and go fill it. Don't take all of them. Leave at least 3 for the hens to sit on. And watch out for the red one. She's mean." Samuel scrambled down from the counter and ran for the door, clearly delighted to have a task. "Clara," Luke continued, "you want to learn to cook on this stove? I'll teach you. But first you need to learn where everything is. Flour's in that bin. Sugar's above it. Salt pork is in the cold box on the porch. Lard is—" "Mr. Mercer," Clara interrupted softly, "why are you being so kind to us?" Luke paused in the middle of reaching for the coffee pot. It was the same question Margaret had asked last night, the same question he'd been asking himself. "Because kindness doesn't cost anything," he said finally, "and I've got plenty to spare." Before Clara could respond, they heard a door open, and Margaret appeared in the doorway, Timmy in her arms. The little boy looked better. His fever was gone, his eyes clearer, but he was still weak, his head resting on his mother's shoulder. Margaret herself looked stronger than she had last night. She'd washed her face and tied back her hair. Someone had clearly lent her a clean dress. Luke vaguely remembered pulling one of Sarah's old dresses from the chest last night and leaving it outside the bedroom door. Seeing Margaret wearing it now hit him harder than he'd expected. "I heard voices," Margaret said, her eyes taking in the scene. "Clara, what are you—" "I was trying to make breakfast," Clara said. "Mr. Mercer's teaching me to use the stove." Margaret's face tightened. "You shouldn't have troubled him." "It's no trouble," Luke said quickly. "In fact, I could use the help. Haven't cooked a real breakfast for more people than myself in years. Likely to burn everything if I try it alone." It was a lie, but a kind one. Margaret seemed to recognize it for what it was, a way to let her children contribute without making them feel like burdens. "Well," she said slowly, "if you're sure, I'm sure." Luke pulled down a bowl and handed it to Clara. "You measure out the flour for biscuits. I'll start the bacon." They worked together in an awkward but functional rhythm. Clara followed Luke's instructions precisely, her young face serious with concentration. Rose sat silently at the table, but Luke noticed she was watching everything, taking it all in. Samuel returned with a basket full of eggs, proud as if he'd hunted them himself. Margaret sat with Timmy, giving the boy small sips of water, whispering encouragement when he managed to swallow. It was domestic and strange and completely foreign to everything Luke's life had been for the past 5 years. And yet, somehow, it felt right. The bacon was sizzling in the pan when Samuel, who'd been looking out the window, suddenly said, "Mr. Mercer, there's a man coming." Luke's hand froze on the spatula. "What?" "A man, on a horse, coming up the road." Margaret's face went white. She clutched Timmy tighter. No, it's too soon. He couldn't have found us already." "Get away from the window," Luke said sharply. "All of you, into the back room, now." Clara grabbed Rose's hand and pulled her toward the hallway. Samuel followed, casting frightened looks back at his mother. Margaret didn't move. "If it's Hale, then I'll deal with him. Go with your children. This is my fight. Not anymore. Luke met her eyes. Please, Margaret, let me handle this. For a moment he thought she might argue, but then Timmy whimpered in her arms and she nodded, backing toward the hallway. Luke waited until he heard the bedroom door close. Then he moved to the window and looked out. A single rider was approaching the house. Not rushing, not slow, just steady. As the man got closer, Luke's shoulders relaxed slightly. He recognized that horse, recognized the rider. He walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch, crossing his arms. The rider pulled up at the fence line and tipped his hat. Luke Mercer, didn't expect to find you entertaining at this hour. Doc Collins, Luke said. What brings you out here? Dr. Henry Collins was a thin man in his 60s with sharp eyes and gentle hands. He'd been the one who tried to save Sarah and Thomas, the one who'd stood beside Luke at their graves and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Got a report yesterday, Doc said, dismounting. Jenny Morrison said she saw you riding toward your place with what looked like a woman in your arms and a string of children following. Naturally, the whole town's curious. Naturally. So I told them I'd ride out this morning, see if you needed any medical assistance. Doc tied his horse to the post and walked up to the porch. Do you? Luke hesitated. He didn't want to bring anyone else into this, didn't want to risk word getting back to whoever Margaret was running from. But Timmy had been desperately sick, and even though the fever had broken, the boy could use a proper examination. Yeah, Luke said finally. I could use your help. He led Doc inside and called for Margaret. She emerged from the bedroom slowly, Timmy still in her arms, her eyes wary. This is Dr. Collins, Luke said. Best doctor in 3 counties. He's here to check on your boy. I don't have money for a doctor, Margaret said stiffly. Doc waved a hand. Didn't ask for money. Luke says the boy's been sick. Let me take a look. Margaret glanced at Luke, who nodded. Slowly, she sat down and let Doc examine Timmy. The old doctor was thorough, checking the boy's eyes and throat, listening to his breathing, feeling his forehead and neck. Timmy submitted to it all with quiet patience, too weak to protest. Fever's broken clean, Doc finally said. Breathing's clear. He'll need rest and plenty of fluids, but he should make a full recovery. He looked at Luke. You do this? Cold water and patience. You learned well. There was approval in Doc's voice, and something else, a kind of sad pride. Your father would be proud. Luke's father had been a country doctor before a fall from a horse killed him when Luke was 16. He taught Luke everything he knew about treating common illnesses. It was knowledge Luke had tried to use to save his son and failed. The other children? Doc asked, turning to Margaret. They're fine, just tired and hungry. Mind if I check them anyway, just to be safe? Margaret called the children out. Doc examined each of them with the same thoroughness. Clara, who bore it with stoic patience. Samuel, who asked questions about every instrument in Doc's bag. And Rose, who remained silent but allowed the examination without protest. They're all healthy, Doc pronounced. Underfed and exhausted, but healthy. A few good meals and some rest will set them right. He paused. Mrs. Bennett. Margaret Bennett. Mrs. Bennett, I don't mean to pry, but those children have the look of people who've been traveling hard. Where are you folks headed? Margaret's jaw tightened. That's our business. Fair enough. Doc closed his bag. But if you're in some kind of trouble, we're fine. Margaret, Luke said quietly, Doc Collins can be trusted. If we're going to figure out what to do about Hale, we need someone who knows the law in this county. Margaret's eyes flashed. I didn't ask you to. I know you didn't, but I'm offering anyway. They stared at each other. The children watched, silent and tense. Finally, Margaret's shoulders sagged. There's a man named Victor Hale. He claims my husband owed him money. $500. He has documents that say it's a legitimate debt, but I know it's not. My husband was many things, but he wasn't a borrower. Doc's face grew serious. Victor Hale. I know that name. He's a debt collector, works for wealthy men who want to keep their hands clean. If he says you owe money, he won't stop until he collects or until you're dead. That's why we ran, Margaret said. But he has men everywhere. He said if I didn't pay, he'd take my children to work off the debt. Luke felt rage flash through him, hot and sudden. He threatened your children? He said it very politely, like he was doing me a favor by giving me a choice. Margaret's voice was bitter. But I knew what it meant. I knew if I stayed, I'd lose them, so we left in the middle of the night with whatever we could carry. And you've been running ever since, Doc said gently. Yes. Doc was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, Do you have the debt papers? Did Hale give you copies? No, he showed them to me but wouldn't let me keep them. Said they were too valuable. That's suspicious right there. Legitimate debt collectors always provide documentation. Doc looked at Luke. This smells wrong. If the debt was real, there'd be no reason to hide the papers. So what do we do? Luke asked. I ride into town, talk to Sheriff Morrison, see if there's been any word about Hale or his employer. Meanwhile, you keep Mrs. Bennett and the children here out of sight. No, Margaret said sharply. I won't hide while other people fight my battles. You're not hiding, Luke said. You're protecting your children. There's a difference. Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but Clara spoke up quietly. Mama, we're safe here. For the first time in weeks, we're safe. Please don't make us leave. Something in Margaret's face crumbled. She looked at her daughter, this fierce, brave girl who'd carried her baby brother for miles, who'd kept her family together when everything was falling apart, and nodded. All right, she whispered. We'll stay, for now. Doc stood. I'll be back tomorrow with whatever information I can find. In the meantime, Luke, keep your eyes open. If Hale's looking for Mrs. Bennett, he might come here. Let him come, Luke said quietly. I'll be ready. After Doc left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the house. The children wandered back to the main room, uncertain what to do with themselves. Margaret stood by the window, staring out at the road. Luke went back to the stove. The bacon was burned, but he salvaged what he could and started fresh. The biscuits Clara had prepared went into the oven. He scrambled eggs and found some preserves in the back of the cupboard. When everything was ready, he set it all on the table. Eat, he said simply. The children didn't need to be told twice. They fell on the food like they hadn't eaten in days, which, Luke reflected, they probably hadn't. Not properly, anyway. Margaret ate more slowly, but Luke noticed she finished everything on her plate. When she caught him watching, she raised her chin defensively. Thank you, she said stiffly, for the meal, and for calling the doctor, and for everything. You already thanked me. I know, but it doesn't feel like enough. Luke started clearing plates, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He'd spent 5 years being thanked by no one, needing no one's appreciation. It felt strange to have it now. You want to thank me, he said. Help Clara learn to cook on that stove. I meant what I said. I could use the help. It was another kindness disguised as practicality. But Margaret seemed to accept it, nodding. The rest of the day passed in a strange domesticity. Clara worked beside Luke in the kitchen, learning how to manage the temperamental stove. Samuel helped feed the chickens and discovered that the mean red hen wasn't so mean if you approached her slowly. Rose spent an hour sitting on the porch with Rufus, the old dog resting his head in her lap while she stroked his fur, still silent but peaceful. Timmy slept most of the day, waking only to drink water and eat a few bites of bread before drifting off again. Luke found himself teaching Clara more than just cooking. He showed her how to draw water from the well without spilling, how to tell if eggs were fresh, how to bank the fire in the stove so it would last through the night. She absorbed every lesson with fierce concentration, as if she were memorizing survival skills for a war she knew was coming. You're a quick learner, Luke said as she successfully flipped a pancake without breaking it. Clara beamed. Mama always said I take after my father. He could learn anything if he watched someone do it once. What did he do? Your father? The smile faded from Clara's face. He worked at a mill, cutting timber. One day a chain broke and the logs... She stopped, her throat working. They said it was fast, that he didn't suffer. Luke recognized the words. They were the same ones people had said about Sarah and Thomas. Meaningless comfort from people who didn't know what else to say. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Everyone's sorry, but sorry doesn't bring him back. Clara's voice was fierce. Sorry doesn't keep men like Hale from trying to take what's left of our family. No, but fighting back does. Clara looked up at him.
You really think we can fight him? A man like that with money and papers and men who work for him? I think your mother's already been fighting him.
Running takes courage too. But yeah, I think we can do more than run. I think we can make him answer for what he's done. How? By finding the truth, by proving those debt papers are fake, by making sure people know what kind of man he is. Luke paused. Your mother's not alone anymore. Neither are you. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I want to believe that. Then believe it. That evening, after the children had eaten and been put to bed, Luke and Margaret sat on the porch again. It was becoming a habit, this quiet time after dark, just the two of them and the stars. Clara told me what you said, Margaret began. About fighting back. You disagree? I don't know. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Part of me wants to fight, wants to stand up and prove that Hale's a liar and my husband's name is clean, but another part of me just wants to keep running, keep my children safe. You can't run forever. I know. Her voice was small. But I don't know how to fight a man like that. I don't have money for lawyers. I don't have proof. All I have is my word against his. Your word counts for something. Does it? I'm a widow with 4 children and no property. He's a debt collector backed by someone with money. Who do you think people will believe? Luke didn't have an answer for that. She was right. In most towns, in most courts, a woman like Margaret would have no power against a man like Hale. But this was Cedar Ridge, and Luke had lived here his whole life. Doc will find out who's backing Hale, Luke said. Once we know that, we can figure out what they want. Men like that always want something specific: land, money, power. If we can figure out their goal, we can find a way to stop them. Margaret looked at him in the darkness. Why are you doing this? Really? It's not just kindness. Nobody risks this much for strangers out of simple kindness. Luke was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 5 years ago, when Sarah and Thomas died, I stopped living. I didn't die, but I stopped living. I went through the motions, woke up, worked, slept. But there was nothing inside, no joy, no pain, no anything, just emptiness. He paused, searching for the right words. Yesterday, when I saw your children standing on that road, something cracked open inside me, something I thought was dead. And when I brought you here, when I heard Clara laugh this morning, when I watched Samuel chase chickens and saw Rose pet my dog, his voice roughened. This house breathed again. For the first time in 5 years, it felt like a home instead of a tomb. Margaret reached out and took his hand just like she had the night before. Thank you for telling me that, she said softly. They sat in silence, hands clasped, until Margaret finally stood to go inside. But at the door, she paused and looked back at him. Luke? Yeah? I'm glad you stopped on that road. I'm glad you didn't ride past us. So am I. After she went inside, Luke stayed on the porch for another hour, thinking about all the ways his life had changed in just 2 days. He thought about the woman sleeping in his wife's bed, wearing his wife's dress. He thought about the children sleeping on the floor of his main room, filling his house with breath and heartbeat and life. He thought about the fight that was coming, because he knew with bone-deep certainty that Victor Hale would come. Men like that always did. But for the first time in 5 years, Luke wasn't afraid of what was coming. He had something to fight for now. The next morning, Doc Collins returned as promised. But he didn't come alone. Luke was in the barn when he heard horses approaching. 2 of them. He grabbed his rifle from where it hung by the door and stepped out into the sunlight. Doc was there, looking grim. And beside him, on a gray mare, was Sheriff Tom Morrison, a big man with a weathered face and steady eyes. Luke, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. Tom, Doc here tells me you've got a situation. Luke glanced at Doc, who gave a small nod. Come inside. In the kitchen, Margaret stood frozen when she saw the sheriff. Her hand moved protectively to where Clara stood beside her. It's all right, Luke said quickly. Sheriff Morrison's a friend. Friend or not, he's still the law, Margaret said, her voice tight. And the law hasn't been friendly to me and mine. Tom removed his hat and held it in his hands. Ma'am, I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm here because Doc says you might be in danger from a man named Victor Hale. That true? Margaret's eyes darted to Luke, then back to the sheriff. Slowly she nodded. Then I need to hear your story, all of it, from the beginning. So Margaret told him. She told him about her husband's death, about Hale showing up 6 weeks later with debt papers, about the threats made against her children. She told him about running, about the dead horse, about Luke finding them on the road. Tom listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Doc's right, he finally said. This smells wrong. Legitimate debt collectors file claims through the county court. They don't show up at night making threats. They especially don't threaten to take children. So you believe me? Margaret's voice was disbelieving. I believe something's not right. Whether the debt's real or not, Hale's methods are illegal. Tom looked at Luke. You got room to keep this family here? Keep them safe while I investigate? They're staying as long as they need to. Good. Tom put his hat back on. Mrs. Bennett, I'm going to need you to stay out of sight for a few days. Don't go into town. Don't show yourself on the road. Let me and Doc ask some questions, see what we can learn about Hale and who he's working for. And then what? Margaret asked. Then we figure out how to stop him. After Tom and Doc left, Margaret sank into a chair, her face pale. I don't understand, she said. Why are they helping us? They don't know us. They don't owe us anything. Because it's the right thing to do, Clara said quietly. She was standing by the window, watching the sheriff and doctor ride away. Because not everyone in the world is like Hale. Margaret pulled her daughter close. I want to believe that, baby. I really do. Luke busied himself making coffee, giving them space for their moment. But he was thinking about what came next, thinking about how to protect this family if, when, Hale came calling. The house had breathed again, yes, but now it needed to learn to fight. 3 days passed, days filled with an uneasy peace. Luke taught Clara and Samuel how to care for the animals. Margaret slowly regained her strength, helping with cooking and cleaning despite Luke's protests that she should rest. Even Rose began to emerge from her shell. She didn't speak, but she started following Luke around the ranch, watching everything he did with those serious eyes. Timmy recovered fully, transforming from a sick, feverish child into an energetic toddler who wanted to touch everything and climb on everything and ask endless questions about the horses and chickens and why the sky was blue. At night, Luke and Margaret continued their ritual of sitting on the porch after the children slept. They talked about small things, the weather, the ranch, memories of people they'd lost. Luke found himself telling her about Sarah, about Thomas, about the life he'd had before fever took it all away. And Margaret told him about her husband, about how they'd met, about their struggles and small joys, about the dreams they'd had for their children. It was the kind of quiet intimacy that Luke had forgotten could exist between two people. On the fourth morning, Tom Morrison returned. This time, his face was darker, grimmer. I found out who's backing Hale, he said without preamble. Edwin Crowley. Luke felt his stomach drop. The land baron? The same. Owns half the county, wants to own the other half, and apparently he wants your ranch. My ranch? Why would... Water rights, Tom said. Your property has the best creek access in the area. Control your land, control the water, control everything downstream. Luke's mind raced. But he can't just take my land. I own it free and clear. No, but he can make your life hell until you sell, or... Tom glanced at Margaret. He can use other leverage. Margaret's face went white. This is about Luke now? Because of us? Looks that way. Hale's been asking around about Luke having visitors, about a woman and children at his ranch. Word's gotten back to Crowley. Then we'll leave, Margaret said immediately, standing. Right now. We'll pack up and go and... No, Luke said. Luke, I won't let you lose everything because you helped us. I said no. Luke's voice was firm. You're not running again. None of you are. But, Margaret, listen to me. Luke moved to stand in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. I should have stood up to men like Crowley years ago. Should have fought when he started pushing other ranchers around, stealing water, forcing people off their land. But I was too buried in my own grief to care. Well, I care now, and I'm not backing down. Tom cleared his throat. Luke, I admire the sentiment, but Crowley's powerful. He's got money, influence, judges in his pocket. If he wants you gone, then he'll have to go through me to get it." The room fell silent. Clara spoke up from where she'd been listening by the door. "What do we do?" Luke looked at the young girl, this brave, fierce child who'd carried her brother for miles, who'd kept her family together through the darkest times. "We fight," he said simply. "We gather evidence. We expose what Crowley's doing. And we make sure everyone in Cedar Ridge knows exactly what kind of man he is." "How?" Margaret asked. Luke turned to Tom. "You said Crowley's been pushing other ranchers around. Who else has he targeted?" Tom thought for a moment. "The Hendersons lost their north pasture last year. Crowley claimed they hadn't paid their taxes, bought the land at auction. The Jeffersons had their barn burned down under suspicious circumstances right before Crowley made them an offer on their property, and old widow Guthrie sold her land for half what it was worth after someone poisoned her well. Did anyone fight back? They tried, but Crowley's lawyers are too good, and he's got sheriff's deputies in the next county on his payroll." Tom paused. "Present company excluded, of course." "What if they all testified together?" Luke said. "What if we got everyone Crowley's hurt in one room and made them tell their stories?" "To who? The judge? He's Crowley's cousin." "Not to a judge, to the whole town." Luke's mind was working now, fitting pieces together. "We call a town meeting. We make it public. We force Crowley to answer for what he's done where everyone can hear." Tom looked doubtful. "Even if people believe you, what's to stop Crowley from just denying everything?" "Evidence," Margaret said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "You need evidence. Documents, witnesses, proof that can't be denied." "And where do we get that?" Tom asked. Margaret's eyes were distant, thinking. "Men like Crowley keep records. They have to. That's how they maintain control. Bills of sale, contracts, correspondence. If we could find those records—" "That's breaking and entering," Tom said flatly. "Only if you get caught," Luke replied. Tom stared at him. "Luke Mercer, are you seriously suggesting—" "I'm suggesting we do whatever it takes to stop a man who's been terrorizing this county for years. I'm suggesting we protect people who can't protect themselves." Luke looked at Margaret and her children. "I'm suggesting we make sure families like this one never have to run again." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Finally, Tom sighed and rubbed his face. "If I were a betting man, which I'm not officially, I'd say Crowley keeps his records in the safe at his ranch house. Big place, east of town. Guards, but not as many during the day when he's in town conducting business." Luke caught the implication. "And when might he be in town conducting business?" "Every Friday. Spends all afternoon at the bank and the land office." Tom met Luke's eyes. "Hypothetically speaking, of course." "Of course." "And hypothetically," Tom continued, "if someone were to acquire evidence through less than legal means, I'd have a hard time using it in any official capacity." "But in an unofficial capacity?" Margaret asked. "At a town meeting where the goal is public opinion rather than legal conviction?" Tom's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Well now, that's a different matter entirely, isn't it?" That night, after the children were asleep and Tom had ridden back to town, Luke and Margaret sat on the porch in silence. "This is dangerous," Margaret finally said. "I know. If you get caught, I won't." "Luke," she turned to face him, "I can't let you risk everything for us." "You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing this, just like I chose to stop on that road." He paused. "Just like I'm choosing to tell you something I probably shouldn't." "What?" Luke took a breath. "These past few days, having you and the children here, it's been the first time since Sarah died that I've felt like I had a reason to wake up in the morning. The first time I felt like maybe there could be something beyond just surviving." He looked at her in the starlight. "I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Margaret's breath caught. "Luke, I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I know it's too soon, and you've been through too much, and maybe I'm a fool for even saying it, but I needed you to know. You and your children, you've given me back something I thought was dead, and I'll fight Crowley or Hale or anyone else to keep it." Margaret was quiet for so long that Luke thought he'd made a terrible mistake. Then she reached out and took his hand.
I never thought I'd feel this way again, she said softly. After my husband died, I thought that part of my life was over, that all I had left was keeping my children safe and alive. She squeezed his hand.
But then you stopped on that road, and you carried me when I couldn't walk, and you saved my son's life, and you gave us a home when we had nowhere else to go. Margaret, I'm not finished. Her voice was firm but gentle. What I'm trying to say is, I think I'm falling in love with you, Luke Mercer, and it terrifies me, because I've already lost one man I loved, and I don't think I could survive losing another. Luke pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. She rested her head against his chest, and they sat like that for a long time, holding each other under the stars. Then we make sure neither of us loses, Luke finally said. We fight, we win, and we build something good out of all this pain. Margaret nodded against his chest. Together? Together. Inside the house, unnoticed by either of them, Clara stood by the window. She'd heard everything, and despite all the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, despite knowing that danger was still coming, she smiled. For the first time in a long time, her family had a chance at something better, and she would fight alongside Luke to protect it. Friday came with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Luke stood on his porch at dawn, drinking coffee that had gone cold in his cup, while he watched the eastern horizon turn from gray to gold. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw 1,000 ways this could go wrong. Crowley's guards catching him, the safe being somewhere other than where Tom thought, the documents not existing at all. But he also saw Margaret's face when she talked about running, saw the exhaustion in Clara's eyes, the fear in Samuel's, saw little Rose's silence, and knew it came from seeing too much darkness for a child her age. So he'd made his choice. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Margaret emerged, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, carrying her own cup of coffee. Couldn't sleep either, she asked, kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And I'm going anyway. Margaret moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. I wish there was another way. So do I. But wishing doesn't change what needs to be done. They stood in silence, watching the sun rise over land that Luke had worked his whole life, land that men like Crowley thought they could simply take because they had money and power and no conscience. When I come back, Luke said quietly, we're going to end this. Whatever I find in that safe, or don't find, we're going to make sure Crowley answers for what he's done. And if you don't come back? Luke turned to look at her. Then you take the children and you run. You go as far and as fast as you can and you don't look back. Luke, promise me, Margaret, if something goes wrong, you save your children. That's all that matters. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. You're coming back. You have to. I intend to. He set down his coffee cup and pulled something from his pocket, a small silver locket that had belonged to Sarah. He'd carried it for 5 years, unable to wear it, but unable to let it go. Now he pressed it into Margaret's hand. But if I don't, I want you to have this. So you remember. Margaret closed her fingers around the locket. Then she grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him down into a kiss. It was fierce and desperate, and full of all the words neither of them knew how to say. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. You come back to me, Luke Mercer, Margaret whispered against his lips. You hear me? You come back. I hear you. By mid-morning, Luke was riding toward Cedar Ridge, his saddlebags packed with rope, a dark coat to hide his silhouette, and the old deputy badge he'd worn before Sarah died. He'd pinned it to his chest before leaving, not because he thought it would protect him, but because it reminded him of who he'd been before grief hollowed him out. A man who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. Tom was waiting at the edge of town, sitting on his horse in the shade of a cottonwood tree. You're sure about this? The sheriff asked as Luke approached. You have a better idea? Several. None of them legal. All of them safer than what you're planning. Luke almost smiled. Then I guess we're doing this the hard way. Tom sighed and pulled out a pocket watch. Crowley left for the bank 20 minutes ago. His foreman said he'd be gone most of the afternoon, had meetings scheduled until at least 4 o'clock. That gives you maybe 5 hours, accounting for travel time. Where will you be? Doing my job, making rounds, being visible,
giving myself an alibi for when Crowley inevitably accuses me of being involved in whatever happens today. Tom met Luke's eyes. Which I'm not. Officially. Officially, Luke echoed.
But if you were to find anything interesting, and if that interesting material were to somehow end up in my office anonymously, well, I'd have a duty to investigate. Understood. Tom handed him a folded piece of paper. Rough layout of Crowley's house, based on what I remember from a party there 2 years ago. Safe should be in his study, second floor, east wing. Guards usually patrol the grounds, but there's only 2 during the day. Most of the security is for nighttime. Luke tucked the paper into his coat. Thank you, Tom. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're back in one piece. The sheriff paused. And Luke? Whatever you find or don't find, we're not done fighting. This is just one move in a longer game. I know. Luke rode on alone, circling wide around Cedar Ridge to approach Crowley's ranch from the north. The land here was different from his own property, more manicured, with fences painted white and pastures that looked like they'd never seen a hard day's work. Everything about it screamed wealth and control. He left his horse tied in a copse of trees about a quarter mile from the main house and continued on foot, using the landscape for cover. The house itself was massive, a 2-story structure with columns and balconies, looking more like something from the Old South than the Texas plains. Luke watched from behind a storage shed for 10 minutes, timing the guards' patrol patterns. Tom had been right, only 2 men, and they were lazy, more concerned with staying in the shade than actually watching for intruders. When both guards were on the far side of the property, Luke moved. He crossed the open ground quickly, pressed himself against the side of the house, and found a window that had been left open to catch the breeze. Within seconds, he was inside. The interior was as ostentatious as the exterior. Thick carpets, oil paintings, furniture that probably cost more than Luke made in 5 years. He moved through it like a ghost, his boots silent on the expensive rugs. The study was exactly where Tom said it would be. Luke slipped inside and closed the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The safe was built into the wall behind a painting of a hunting scene. Luke pulled the painting aside and stared at the heavy iron door with its combination lock. This was the moment. Either he got it open, or this whole thing was for nothing. He pulled out the tools he'd brought, a stethoscope he'd borrowed from Doc Collins under the pretense of checking on Timmy, and a small notebook to record the combination. Breaking safes wasn't something he'd ever done, but his father had taught him the principle: patience, a steady hand, and a good ear. Luke pressed the stethoscope to the safe door and began turning the dial. Click, click, click. Each tumbler falling into place made a sound, subtle but distinct. Luke worked slowly, methodically, the way his father had taught him to suture wounds, with precision and without rushing. 15 minutes passed. 20. Then with a final soft click, the safe door swung open. Luke let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Inside was exactly what Margaret had predicted. Documents, stacks of them, contracts, bills of sale, correspondence. Luke began pulling them out, scanning each one quickly. The Henderson property, purchased at tax auction after Crowley had bribed the county assessor to claim their taxes were unpaid. The Jefferson land, acquired for a fraction of its value 3 days after their barn mysteriously burned down. A separate document showed payment to a man named Dutch Miller for services rendered on the same date as the fire. Widow Guthrie's farm, sold under duress after someone poisoned her well. Another payment, this time to a man named Pike, for contract work. And there, near the bottom of the stack, Luke found what he was looking for. Margaret Bennett. The debt papers were there, claiming her late husband owed $500 for gambling debts. But clipped to them was a letter in Crowley's own handwriting, addressed to Victor Hale. Luke read it twice, his anger growing with each word. The debt was completely fabricated. Crowley had created it specifically to force Margaret off land she didn't even own, land that had belonged to her late husband's family, land that Crowley wanted because it bordered Luke's property. The plan had been to take Margaret's children as collateral, use them as leverage to force Luke to sell his ranch to get them back. It was calculated, cruel. And it had nearly worked. Luke's hands shook as he folded the letter and tucked it into his coat along with the other documents. He was replacing the empty folders, making it look like nothing had been disturbed, when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps. Multiple people. Luke froze. "Told you, the window in the drawing room was open," a voice said. One of the guards. "Didn't leave it that way this morning." "Probably just the wind," another voice replied. "Wind doesn't unlatch windows." The footsteps were getting closer. Luke looked around desperately. The door to the study was the only exit, and the guards were between him and it. The window was too high and would make too much noise. The only other option was a closet in the corner, barely large enough for a man to fit inside. Luke crossed to it in 3 silent steps and pulled the door shut just as the study door opened. Through the crack in the closet door, he could see 2 guards enter, both armed, both looking suspicious. "Nothing in here," the first one said, scanning the room. "Check behind the desk and the safe." Luke's heart stopped. The guard crossed to the safe and examined it. The painting was back in place. But would he notice it had been moved? Would he check inside? Long seconds passed while the guard stared at the safe. Then he turned away. "Safe's locked. Everything looks fine." "You're jumping at shadows, Pete." "Maybe, but if something did happen and we didn't catch it, Crowley would have our heads." "Nothing happened. Now come on, it's too hot to be wandering around inside all day." The guards left, their footsteps fading down the hallway. Luke waited 5 more minutes, barely breathing, before he emerged from the closet. He crossed to the window, checked that the guards were occupied on the other side of the house, and slipped out. Getting back to his horse felt like the longest walk of his life. Every shadow looked like a guard, every sound like someone shouting an alarm. But he made it to the trees, mounted up, and rode hard for Cedar Ridge. He didn't slow down until he reached Tom's office. The sheriff took one look at Luke's face and closed the door. "You got it?" Luke pulled the documents from his coat and spread them on Tom's desk. Tom read through them, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "This is worse than I thought. Crowley's not just stealing land, he's orchestrating a whole system. Bribes, arson, extortion." He picked up the letter about Margaret. "And this? Creating a fake debt to terrorize a widow and her children. Can we use it?" Luke interrupted. "Will this be enough? For a legal case? Maybe, if we had an honest judge, but we don't." Tom tapped the documents. "But for what you're planning, the town meeting, this is perfect. This is the kind of evidence people can understand. Clear, simple, damning." "Then we call the meeting." "When?" "Tomorrow, Sunday, after church. Everyone will be in town anyway." Tom nodded slowly. "I'll spread the word."
But Luke, you know what this means, right? Once we do this, once we make this public, Crowley will come after you with everything he has. Let him come. And what about Mrs. Bennett and the children? You think Crowley won't use them against you? Luke's jaw tightened. Then we make sure they're protected. Can you keep them safe at your office during the meeting? I can try, but Tom, I need you to promise me. Whatever happens, whatever Crowley does, you keep Margaret and those children safe. The sheriff studied Luke's face for a long moment. Then he nodded. You have my word. Luke rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, his saddlebags full of copied documents that Tom had helped him duplicate. The originals were locked in the sheriff's safe, evidence that couldn't be destroyed or stolen. Margaret was waiting on the porch, pacing. When she saw him riding up the path, she ran down the steps. Luke dismounted and caught her as she threw herself into his arms. "You're alive," she said against his chest. "You're alive. You're safe. You came back." "I told you I would." "Did you find anything?" "Everything." Luke pulled back to look at her. "I found proof of all of it. The bribes, the extortion, the fake debt papers, everything we need to destroy Crowley." Relief flooded Margaret's face, followed quickly by fear. "And now?" "Now we fight. Tomorrow, after church, we're calling a town meeting. We're going to show everyone exactly what kind of man Edwin Crowley is. He'll retaliate. I'm counting on it. But this time, when he comes, the whole town will be watching. He won't be able to hide in the shadows anymore." Margaret took his face in her hands. "You're sure about this? Once we do this, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They stood there for a moment, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky. Then Clara's voice called from the house. "Mama, is Mr. Mercer back?" "He's back, baby," Margaret called.
Everything's all right." But as they walked toward the house together, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that everything was far from all right. The real fight was just beginning. That night, Luke gathered everyone in the main room: Margaret, Clara, Samuel, even little Rose, who watched everything with her serious eyes while Timmy dozed in his mother's lap. "I need to tell you all what's going to happen tomorrow," Luke began, "and I need you to understand that it might get dangerous." Clara sat up straighter. "We're not afraid." "I know you're not, but you should be. Edwin Crowley is a powerful man, and when we expose him tomorrow, he's going to be angry. He might try to hurt us. He might try to take everything I have." "Then why are we doing it?" Samuel asked, his young voice confused. Luke crouched down so he was eye level with the boy. "Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do. And because if we don't stop men like Crowley, they'll just keep hurting people. People like your mother. People like you." "Will we have to leave?" Rose asked. Everyone turned to stare. It was the first time Rose had spoken since they'd arrived at the ranch. Her voice was small but clear. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Rose, will we have to leave?" Rose asked again, looking at Luke. "After tomorrow, will we have to run again?" Luke moved to kneel in front of her. "No, sweetheart, you're not running anymore. None of you are. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Promise?" "I promise." Rose nodded, satisfied, and went back to being silent. But something in her face had changed. She looked less afraid, more settled. Margaret was crying quietly, tears streaming down her face. Clara had her arm around her mother, and Samuel had pressed close to her other side. "We're with you, Mr. Mercer," Clara said firmly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we're with you. Thank you." Luke's voice was rough. "But tomorrow, I need you all to stay with Sheriff Morrison. He's going to keep you safe while I—" "No," Margaret interrupted. "Absolutely not." "Margaret, I'm not hiding anymore, Luke. You said we were fighting this together. That means I stand beside you when you face Crowley. That means my children see that their mother doesn't run when things get hard." "It's too dangerous. Life is dangerous. Running was dangerous. Starving on the road with a dead horse was dangerous." Margaret's voice was fierce. "But standing up for what's right? Standing beside the man who saved our lives? That's not dangerous. That's necessary." Luke looked at her, this proud, stubborn, brave woman who'd been through hell and come out fighting, and realized he'd lost this argument before it started. "All right," he said quietly. "We stand together." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Luke dressed in his best clothes, the suit he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, pressed and cleaned. He pinned his deputy badge to his chest and looked at himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him was different from the one who'd stopped on that road a week ago. That man had been hollow, going through the motions of living without really being alive. This man had purpose, had something to fight for, had something to lose. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him, wearing Sarah's best dress. Luke had given it to her the night before, and seeing her in it didn't hurt the way he'd expected. Instead, it felt right, like Sarah's things were being used the way they were meant to be, by someone who needed them. "You look beautiful," Luke said. Margaret smiled. "You look like a man about to change the world." "I'm just trying to protect what's mine." "That's how it starts." She crossed to him and adjusted his badge. "That's how all good things start, with one person deciding that enough is enough." They rode into Cedar Ridge together. All 6 of them crowded onto the wagon Luke had hitched up that morning. Clara sat up front with Luke and Margaret, while Samuel, Rose, and Timmy sat in the back. The town was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Word had spread about the meeting, and people were gathering in front of the church, talking in small clusters. Luke recognized faces: the Hendersons, the Jeffersons, Widow Guthrie, and dozens of others. People who'd been hurt by Crowley but had been too afraid or powerless to fight back. Until now. Tom was waiting by the church steps, looking official in his full sheriff's uniform. Doc Collins stood beside him, and several other men Luke recognized as honest citizens who'd lived in Cedar Ridge their whole lives. "Good turnout," Tom said quietly as Luke approached. "Think it'll be enough?" "We're about to find out." Luke helped Margaret and the children down from the wagon. Claire immediately took charge of her siblings, keeping them close. Rose held her mother's hand on one side while Margaret held Timmy on her hip. They looked like what they were, a family that had been through fire and survived. The church bell rang, calling people to gather. Luke walked up the steps and turned to face the crowd. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know Sunday afternoon is precious time, especially for those of you with families to tend and work to do. But what I have to say, what we all need to hear, can't wait any longer." The crowd quieted, faces turning up toward him with curiosity and concern. "For years," Luke continued, "we've watched as our neighbors lost their land, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods. We've heard the stories, tax debts that appeared out of nowhere, fires that started mysteriously, wells that suddenly ran dry. We've watched good people driven out of Cedar Ridge by circumstances that seemed like bad luck." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But it wasn't bad luck. It was Edwin Crowley." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people nodded. Others looked shocked. A few looked scared. "I know that's a serious accusation," Luke said. "I know Crowley's a powerful man with influence and money, but I have proof. Documents that show exactly what he's been doing, how he's been stealing land, bribing officials, terrorizing families." "Where'd you get these documents?" someone shouted from the crowd. "From Crowley's own safe, in his own handwriting, letters, contracts, payments for crimes committed on his orders." The murmur grew louder. "I know some of you are thinking I'm lying, that I have some grudge against Crowley, some reason to make this up, so I'm going to let the evidence speak for itself." Luke pulled out the first document and began to read. The tax assessment for the Henderson property, showing where the county assessor had been paid to falsify records. Then the payment to Dutch Miller for burning the Jefferson barn. Then the contract to poison Widow Guthrie's well. With each revelation, the crowd's mood shifted, from skeptical to shocked to angry. Luke saved the letter about Margaret for last. "And this," he said, holding it up, "is a letter from Edwin Crowley to a man named Victor Hale. In it, Crowley orders Hale to create a false debt claim against a widow named Margaret Bennett. The goal was to take her children as collateral and use them to force me to sell my ranch." He looked directly at Margaret, who stood in the crowd with her children gathered around her. Mrs. Bennett and her 4 children nearly died on the road because of this man's greed, and she's not the only one. How many of you have lost property to Crowley? How many have been threatened or intimidated or driven away? Hands began to rise, to first a few, then more, then dozens. "Then it's time we stood together," Luke said. "Time we told Edwin Crowley that Cedar Ridge is not for sale. That our land, our homes, our families, they belong to us, not to him." The crowd was roaring now, people shouting their agreement, their anger finally finding a voice. That's when Luke saw him. Edwin Crowley stood at the back of the crowd, flanked by 4 hired men. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with silver hair and cold eyes. And he was smiling. "That's quite a speech, Mr. Mercer," Crowley called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "Quite dramatic, but I'm afraid you're mistaken." The crowd parted to let him through. "These documents you claim to have. Where did you say you got them? From my private safe?" Crowley's smile widened. "That's breaking and entering, Mr. Mercer. That's a crime. Sheriff Morrison, I trust you'll be arresting this man?" Tom stepped forward. "I'll be investigating all crimes committed in my jurisdiction, Mr. Crowley, including the ones detailed in these documents. Documents obtained illegally, inadmissible in any court of law." "Maybe," Tom agreed, "but we're not in a court of law right now. We're in the court of public opinion, and these people have a right to know what you've done." Crowley's smile faded. His eyes swept the crowd, measuring, calculating. Then they landed on Margaret and the children. "Ah, Mrs. Bennett," he said smoothly. "Still running from your legal obligations, I see. Mr. Hale will be so disappointed." Margaret stepped forward, her chin high. "There are no legal obligations. My husband never owed you money. You fabricated that debt to steal land that doesn't even belong to me." "Can you prove that?" "Can you?" Margaret shot back. "Can you produce one piece of real evidence that my husband ever borrowed money from you? Can you show one witness who saw him gamble? Can you provide anything except papers you created yourself?" Crowley's face darkened. "You're making serious accusations, madam." "So are you. The difference is, we have evidence. All you have are lies. The crowd was watching this exchange like a tennis match, heads turning from Margaret to Crowley and back again. This is absurd, Crowley said, turning to address the crowd. You're all going to take the word of a transient widow and a grieving rancher over mine? I've lived in this county for 30 years. I've provided jobs, built businesses, invested in this community. And this is how you repay me? By believing the lies of strangers? They're not strangers, a voice called out. It was Henderson, stepping forward. And they're not lying. You stole my land, Crowley. Everyone here knows it. And you burned my barn, Jefferson added, moving to stand beside Henderson. You poisoned my well, Widow Guthrie said, her old voice shaking with anger. Nearly killed my grandchildren when they drank that water. One by one, people stepped forward, each with a story, each with a grievance, each adding their voice to the chorus of accusations. Crowley's face grew redder with each testimony, his hands clenched into fists. You're all fools, he finally snarled. You think you can stand against me? I own this county. I own the judges, the land office, half the merchants in town. You have nothing. You are nothing. We have each other, Luke said quietly. And we have the truth. Truth? Crowley laughed, bitter and harsh. Truth is whatever I say it is. Truth is what a judge rules in my courtroom with my money in his pocket. You can have your little meeting, Mercer. You can stand here and tell your stories. But when it's over, I'll still own this county. And you, he pointed at Luke, you'll lose everything. Your ranch, your dignity, maybe even your freedom when I have the sheriff arrest you for breaking into my home. I wouldn't count on that, Tom said calmly. Crowley whirled on him. You work for me, Morrison. I work for the people of this county, and they're standing right here. The crowd roared its approval. Crowley's face twisted with rage. He looked around at the sea of angry faces, at the people he'd terrorized and stolen from, and Luke saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. You want a war? Crowley said softly, his voice carrying despite the noise. Then you'll have one. And when I'm done, there won't be enough left of any of you to bury. He turned and strode away, his hired men following. The crowd watched him go, then erupted into cheers. But Luke didn't feel like celebrating. He'd seen that look in Crowley's eyes. He'd heard the promise in his voice. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence that followed Crowley's departure was thick with tension and possibility. Luke stood on the church steps watching the crowd, watching people who'd spent years being afraid finally finding their voices. Henderson and Jefferson were talking in urgent whispers with 3 other ranchers. Widow Guthrie was surrounded by women from town, all of them sharing stories Luke suspected had been kept quiet for far too long. Even the merchants who'd always stayed neutral were nodding along, their faces grave. Tom climbed the steps to stand beside Luke. You just kicked a hornet's nest, he said quietly. I know. Crowley's not going to let this go. He'll come after you with everything he has. I know that too. And you're still planning to see this through? Luke looked down at where Margaret stood with her children. Clara had her arms around Samuel and Rose, while Timmy clung to his mother's skirt. They all looked tired and scared, but there was something else there too. Hope. The fragile, dangerous kind of hope that comes from watching someone stand up and fight. Yeah, Luke said. I'm seeing it through. Tom nodded slowly. Then we'd better prepare. Because whatever Crowley's planning, it's going to come fast and it's going to come hard. The crowd began to disperse as the afternoon wore on, but not before dozens of people approached Luke personally. They shook his hand, thanked him, pledged their support. Some offered money they couldn't spare. Others offered to stand guard at his ranch or help rebuild if Crowley tried to burn it down. A few of the younger men offered to ride out to Crowley's place and settle things the old way. Luke declined that last offer firmly, but the gesture itself meant something. Cedar Ridge was waking up, was remembering what it meant to stand together. Margaret waited until most of the crowd had gone before approaching with the children. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with emotion Luke couldn't quite read. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, she said. Or the stupidest. Maybe both. She took his hand, but thank you. For standing up there and telling the truth, for making people see what Crowley really is, for giving all of us a chance to stop running. Clara tugged on Luke's sleeve. Mr. Mercer, What happens now? It was the question on everyone's mind. Luke crouched down to the girl's level. Now we go home, he said, and we prepare, and we wait to see what Crowley does next. And if he comes after us, then we fight, but not alone. You saw all those people today. You heard what they said. We're not alone anymore. Clara nodded, but her young face was still creased with worry. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of us. Hey! Luke put a hand on her shoulder. This stopped being just about you and your family the moment I found those documents. This is about everyone Crowley's hurt, everyone he's stolen from, everyone he's terrorized.
You didn't cause this. He did. But if you hadn't come here, I'd still be living in an empty house, going through the motions, not really alive. You and your family woke me up, gave me a reason to care again. Whatever happens next, I wouldn't trade that for anything. Margaret's hand tightened on his. When Luke looked up at her, there were tears streaming down her face. We should go, Tom said gently. Sun's getting low, and I don't want you on the road after dark. Not tonight. They made it back to the ranch without incident, but Luke kept his rifle across his lap the whole way and his eyes on the horizon. Twice he thought he saw riders in the distance, but they never came close enough to identify. That night, Luke didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his rifle, watching the darkness, listening to every sound. Inside, Margaret had put the children to bed and tried to convince Luke to rest, but he'd refused. If Crowley was going to make a move, it would be tonight when Luke's guard might be down after the emotional toll of the day. Around midnight, Margaret brought him coffee and a blanket and sat down beside him without asking permission. You can't stay awake forever, she said. I can try. Luke. She took the rifle from his hands and set it aside. Look at me. He turned to face her in the darkness. Whatever happens, Margaret said, whatever Crowley does or doesn't do, I want you to know something. These past 2 weeks have been the first time since my husband died that I've felt like myself, like a person instead of just a mother trying to keep her children alive. You did that. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost. Margaret, I'm not finished. Her voice was firm but tender. I know this is complicated. I know we've both lost people we loved. I know it's too soon and too fast and probably too dangerous to feel what I'm feeling, but I need to say it anyway, before something happens and I lose the chance. Luke's heart was hammering. Say what? That I love you, Luke Mercer. I love your kindness and your courage and the way you teach my children things without making them feel small. I love the way you look at me like I'm strong instead of broken. I love that you stopped on that road when you could have ridden past. She took his face in her hands, and I love that you're sitting here in the dark with a rifle trying to protect us, even though you know it might cost you everything. Luke couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. 5 years of carefully constructed walls were crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it, didn't want to stop it. I love you too, he finally managed. I didn't think I could feel this way again. Didn't think I deserved to. But then you showed up with your fierce pride and your brave children, and you made me remember what it felt like to be alive. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. Whatever happens, Luke said, whatever Crowley does, we face it together. You and me and those 4 amazing children of yours. Our children, Margaret corrected gently. If you'll have them. Luke thought about Clara's determination, Samuel's curiosity, Rose's quiet strength, Timmy's infectious joy. Thought about how they'd filled his empty house with laughter and life and purpose. I'd be honored, he said. They sat together on the porch until dawn, holding hands, watching the stars fade into morning light. And when the sun finally rose over the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, neither of them had any idea that the real test was about to begin. The attack came 3 days later. Luke was in the barn repairing a broken stall door when he heard the sound of approaching horses. A lot of them, moving fast. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside just as 8 riders came thundering up the path toward the house. Crowley's men. Luke recognized 2 of them from the town meeting. "Margaret," he shouted, "get the children inside, lock the doors."
He saw her face appear at the window, saw her eyes go wide with fear, then saw her disappear as she gathered the children. The riders pulled up at the property line. None of them dismounted, but all of them had guns drawn. The leader, a thick-necked man with a scar across his jaw, spoke first. "Mr. Crowley sends his regards. Says you got 48 hours to get off this land before we come back and remove you ourselves." "This is my property," Luke said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Legally owned. Crowley has no claim to it." "Mr. Crowley says otherwise. Says you're trespassing on land that's rightfully his." The man smiled, showing brown teeth. "Now, we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. But either way, you're leaving." "I'm not going anywhere." The smile vanished. "Then I guess we're doing it hard." The man raised his gun. A shot rang out, kicking up dust 5 feet in front of the riders' horses. The animals spooked, backing up, their riders fighting to control them. Luke spun around to see Tom Morrison riding up from the south, his rifle still smoking. "That was a warning," the sheriff called out. "Next one won't be. This is private property and you men are trespassing. I suggest you leave before I arrest the lot of you." "You can't arrest us for delivering a message," the scarred man snarled. "No, but I can arrest you for brandishing weapons with intent to threaten. I can arrest you for trespassing after being warned. And I can arrest you for working for a man who's currently under investigation for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy." Tom rode closer, his rifle never wavering. "So you boys have a choice. You can ride back to Crowley and tell him his threats won't work. Or you can stick around and spend the next few nights in my jail. What's it gonna be?" The riders exchanged glances. After a long moment, the scarred man spat in the dust. "Crowley ain't gonna forget this, Sheriff." "I'm counting on it." The riders turned and galloped away, raising a cloud of dust that took several minutes to settle. Tom dismounted and walked over to where Luke stood, his knuckles white around his rifle. "You all right?" the sheriff asked. "Yeah, thanks to you." Luke took a shaky breath. "How'd you know they'd come?" "I've been watching Crowley's place since the meeting. Saw his men ride out this morning and figured they were headed here." Tom looked toward the house where Margaret and the children were cautiously emerging. "This is just the beginning, Luke. He's testing you, seeing if you'll break." "I won't." "I know, but he doesn't know that yet. And he's got resources we don't have. Men, money, influence. We need to be smart about this." Luke nodded. "What do you suggest?" "First, you don't stay here alone. Get some of the men who offered to help at the meeting. Have them take shifts watching the property. Second, we move fast on building a legal case. I've sent word to the territorial judge in Austin about Crowley's documents. It'll take time, but if we can get a real investigation started..." "How much time?" Tom's silence was answer enough. "Right," Luke said. "So we hold out as long as we can and hope help arrives before Crowley decides to stop playing games." "That's about the size of it." Margaret approached, Timmy on her hip and the other children clustered around her. "Are they gone?" "For now," Tom said. "But they'll be back, Mrs. Bennett, and next time they might bring more men." "Then what do we do?" Before anyone could answer, they heard the sound of more horses. Luke raised his rifle again, but Tom put a hand on his arm. "Wait, those are friendlies." Sure enough, Henderson and Jefferson rode up the path, followed by 4 other ranchers and 3 men from town, all of them armed. Henderson dismounted first. "Heard there was trouble out here. Thought you might could use some help." Luke felt something loosen in his chest. "You didn't have to come." "The hell we didn't," Jefferson said, climbing down from his horse. "Crowley's men come after you. They're coming after all of us. We stand together or we fall separately." The other men nodded their agreement. "We've worked out a schedule," Henderson continued. 2 men on watch at all times, rotating every 6 hours. We'll set up a camp by the tree line so we don't crowd your house. And we brought supplies, food, ammunition, medical supplies if it comes to that." "I don't know what to say," Luke managed. "Don't say anything. Just don't give up. Because if you give up, we all give up. And I'll be damned if I let Crowley win without a fight." Over the next few days, Luke's ranch transformed into something like a military camp. The men set up tents and built a fire pit. They established watch positions with clear sight lines to all approaches. Margaret organized the food supplies and cooked meals for everyone, helped by Clara, who'd become remarkably adept in the kitchen. Samuel appointed himself the camp's messenger, running information between the watch posts and the main house. Even little Rose contributed, tending to the horses and chickens with quiet efficiency. Timmy, too young to understand the danger, treated the whole thing like an adventure. He followed the men around, asking endless questions about their guns and horses and whether they'd ever fought in a real battle. Luke watched it all with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride because his neighbors had come together to stand against injustice. Fear because he knew what Crowley was capable of and what this could cost them all. On the fourth night after the confrontation, Luke was on watch with Jefferson when they saw lights in the distance. A lot of lights, moving toward the ranch. "Wake everyone," Luke said quietly. "This is it." Jefferson ran for the camp while Luke rang the bell he'd set up as a warning system. Within minutes, every man was up and armed, taking their positions. The lights resolved into torches as they got closer. And behind the torches, Luke could see riders. At least 20 of them, maybe more. They stopped at the property line. Crowley himself rode at the front, torch in hand, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "Mr. Mercer," he called out, "I gave you 48 hours. The time is up." "And I told your men I'm not leaving," Luke called back. "This is my land, legally owned and paid for. You have no right to it." "I have every right. This land should have been mine years ago. Your stubborn refusal to sell has cost me time and money. But that ends tonight." "You planning to burn me out, Crowley? In front of 20 witnesses? In front of the sheriff himself?" Luke gestured to where Tom stood with his rifle. "Because that would be real stupid, even for you." Crowley's smile was cold. "I'm not here to burn you out, Mr. Mercer. I'm here to make you an offer, one last chance to do this the easy way." "I'm listening." "I'll pay you double what this land is worth. I'll drop all charges related to you breaking into my home. I'll even let Mrs. Bennett and her children go free and clear of any debt." He paused. "All you have to do is sign the deed over to me tonight and leave Cedar Ridge tomorrow." "And if I refuse?" "Then I stop being reasonable. I own the bank that holds mortgages for half the men standing with you right now. I own the general store where their wives buy supplies. I own the livery where they stable their horses. One word from me and all of them lose everything." Crowley's voice hardened. "You think you're protecting them by standing up to me? You're destroying them. Their families will starve because of your pride." Luke looked around at the men who'd come to stand with him. Henderson's face was pale but determined. Jefferson's jaw was set. The others looked scared, but none of them moved. "What do you say, boys?" Luke called out. "You want me to sell?" "Hell no," Henderson said immediately. "We didn't come here to watch you surrender," Jefferson added. One by one, the other men voiced their agreement. They'd made their choice, and they were sticking to it. Luke turned back to Crowley. "I guess you have your answer." Crowley's face twisted with rage. "You're all fools, brave, stupid fools, and when I'm done with you—" "Mr. Crowley," the voice came from behind Luke. Margaret stepped out of the house, still wearing her nightgown with a shawl thrown over her shoulders. Clara stood beside her, and behind them, Luke could see Samuel and Rose watching from the window. "Mrs. Bennett," Crowley said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "how lovely to see you again." "I have something to say to you," Margaret said, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor Luke could hear underneath. "You tried to destroy my family. You fabricated debts and sent men to threaten my children. You made us run until we nearly died on a dusty road in the middle of nowhere. Business, my dear, nothing personal. It was personal to me. It was personal to my children who cried themselves to sleep every night wondering if tomorrow would be the day we starved or got caught. It was personal to my daughter who had to grow up too fast trying to keep her brothers and sisters safe." Margaret moved to stand beside Luke. "But you made a mistake." "Did I?" "You thought I was alone. You thought I was weak because I was a widow with no money and no power. But you were wrong. I'm not alone. I have Luke. I have these men who came to stand with us. I have a whole town full of people who are finally seeing you for what you really are. A bully and a thief." Strong words from someone who's one torch away from losing everything. "We've already lost everything," Margaret said simply. "My husband is dead. Luke's wife and son are dead. These men have been robbed and terrorized and driven to the edge of ruin by you. We have nothing left to lose. But you
She smiled, and it was not a kind smile. You have everything to lose, your reputation, your power, your control over this county, and we're going to take it all away from you. Crowley stared at her, his face mottled with fury. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Yes, I do. I'm dealing with a coward who hides behind hired guns and falsified documents because he's too weak to build something real on his own. Margaret's voice rang out across the property. I'm dealing with a man so pathetic that he has to threaten children to get what he wants. I'm dealing with someone who's about to learn that money and power mean nothing when you've lost the respect of everyone around you. For a long moment, Crowley said nothing. Then he raised his hand, and Luke saw his men reach for their guns. Stop right there, Tom said, his rifle aimed directly at Crowley. You give that order, and you're the first one who dies. I guarantee it. Crowley lowered his hand slowly. This isn't over. No, Luke agreed. It's not. But you're not going to win by burning us out or scaring us into leaving. The only way this ends is when a court of law hears the evidence and makes a ruling. And I'm betting they're going to rule against you. You'd be betting wrong, Crowley said. I own the judges, remember? You own the local judges, Tom corrected. But I sent all those documents to the territorial judge in Austin 3 days ago. By now, there's a formal investigation underway. And that judge, he doesn't take kindly to corruption. Doesn't matter how much money you have or who you know. Once he starts digging, he doesn't stop until he finds the truth. Luke saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross Crowley's face. You're bluffing, Crowley said. Am I? You want to take that chance because I'm betting you've got skeletons buried all over this county, and once that judge starts finding them, well, Tom smiled, I imagine you'll have bigger problems than one stubborn rancher who won't sell his land. Crowley's hand tightened on his torch. For a moment, Luke thought he might throw it anyway, start the fire, and damn the consequences. But then he seemed to regain control. This isn't over, he said again. You already said that, Margaret replied. Now either shoot us or leave. We're getting tired of listening to you talk. Luke couldn't help it. He laughed. Several of the men behind him joined in, and even Tom was smiling. Crowley's face went purple with rage. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following, but as they disappeared into the darkness, Luke noticed something. One of Crowley's men had stayed behind. The man dismounted and walked forward slowly, hands up to show he was unarmed. As he got closer, Luke recognized him. It was the scarred man who'd delivered Crowley's ultimatum days earlier. I'm not here to cause trouble, the man said. I just want to talk. Talk fast, Tom said, his rifle still raised. My name's Pike. I've worked for Crowley for 5 years. Did things I'm not proud of. Burned barns, poisoned wells, roughed up people who couldn't pay their debts. He paused. But I never signed on to hurt children. And when Crowley told us tonight that if you didn't sell, we were supposed to take the kids, make an example of them, I couldn't do it. Luke felt his blood run cold. He ordered you to hurt the children, Pike nodded. Said it was the only way to make you understand he was serious. Said we were supposed to wait until you were distracted, then grab the kids, and he stopped looking sick. I got kids of my own, Mr. Mercer. I won't do that. What do you want from us? Tom asked. I want to help. I can testify about everything Crowley's done. Every crime he ordered, every person he hurt. I kept records, names, dates, payments. Figured someday I might need insurance in case Crowley decided to get rid of loose ends. Pike pulled a folded packet from his coat. It's all here. Everything you need to prove what he's done. Luke took the packet with shaking hands. Inside were pages and pages of detailed notes, written in a cramped but legible hand. Names of victims, amounts paid for various crimes, even copies of some of Crowley's letters. Why now? Luke asked. Why turn on him now? Because I'm tired of being the kind of man who hurts people for money. Because my kids look at me and I can see them wondering what their daddy does for work. And I don't want to lie to them anymore. Pike met Luke's eyes. And because watching that woman stand up to Crowley, watching her call him a coward to his face, it reminded me that there are still people in this world who have courage, real courage, not the fake kind that comes from holding a gun. Margaret stepped forward. If you testify, Crowley will come after you. I know, but I'd rather die standing up than live on my knees. Pike looked at Tom. Will you protect my family, my wife and kids? They're in town. If Crowley finds out I turned on him, I'll send deputies to watch your house tonight, Tom promised, and we'll get them somewhere safe until this is all over. Pike nodded, relief flooding his face. Thank you. As Pike left to retrieve his family, Luke looked down at the packet in his hands. With this testimony, combined with the documents they'd already gathered, they had enough to not just expose Crowley, but to destroy him completely. We have him, Luke said quietly. We actually have him. Margaret slipped her hand into his. Does this mean it's over? Not yet. Crowley's still out there, still dangerous, but for the first time, I think we might actually win this. The men who'd been standing guard started to relax, some of them even cheering. Henderson clapped Luke on the back. Jefferson started talking about celebrating. The tension that had been building for days finally began to ease, but Luke couldn't quite celebrate yet. He kept thinking about what Pike had said, that Crowley had ordered them to take the children, that he'd been willing to hurt kids to get what he wanted. That kind of evil didn't just give up because it was beaten. It lashed out. It tried to take as many people down with it as possible. Luke pulled Tom aside. We need to end this fast, before Crowley does something desperate. I agree. I'll ride to Austin first thing in the morning, deliver Pike's testimony personally. With any luck, we'll have federal marshals here within the week. And until then, we keep our guard up. We protect your family and Pike's family and anyone else Crowley might target. Tom paused. And we pray that Crowley's smart enough to know when he's beaten. But as Luke looked out into the darkness where Crowley had disappeared, he knew prayer wouldn't be enough. They needed to be ready for whatever came next, because men like Edwin Crowley didn't go down without a fight. And the closer they got to losing, the more dangerous they became. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky when Luke heard the sound of a single horse approaching at full gallop. He was already awake, hadn't really slept since Crowley's men had left hours earlier. He'd spent the night going through Pike's documents, memorizing every detail, every crime, every victim. The weight of it all sat heavy on his chest, not just what Crowley had done, but what Luke himself had allowed to happen by staying silent for so long. The rider came into view as the dawn light strengthened. It was one of Tom's deputies, a young man named Carter, and even from a distance, Luke could see the urgency in the way he rode. Luke was off the porch and running before Carter even pulled his horse to a stop. What happened? Luke demanded. Carter was breathing hard, his face pale. It's Crowley. He's barricaded himself in his ranch house with about a dozen men. Sheriff Morrison rode out there at first light to serve him with papers for the territorial investigation, and Crowley refused to come out. Said if anyone tries to come in, he'll burn the whole place down with everyone inside. Luke felt his stomach drop. Is Tom still out there? Yeah, with 3 deputies, but they can't get close. Crowley's men are shooting at anyone who approaches the property line. Carter wiped sweat from his forehead. Sheriff sent me to get you. Said you're the only person Crowley might still listen to. Why would he listen to me? I'm the one who exposed him. I don't know, Mr. Mercer, but the sheriff thinks you're the only chance we have of ending this without bloodshed. Margaret appeared in the doorway, pulling her shawl tight against the morning chill. Luke? What's going on? Crowley's holed up at his ranch. Tom wants me to try to talk him down. Then I'm coming with you. No, it's too dangerous. Luke Mercer, don't you dare try to protect me now. You said we face things together, remember? Her eyes were fierce. Besides, I have a few things I'd like to say to Mr. Crowley myself. Luke wanted to argue, wanted to keep her safe at the ranch where Crowley couldn't reach her. But he also knew that look in her eyes, the same stubborn determination he'd seen that first day on the dusty road. Margaret Bennett wasn't going to be left behind. Fine, he said, but you stay back. If shooting starts, we'll both run. Deal? Deal. Henderson and Jefferson insisted on coming too, along with 2 other ranchers who'd been standing watch. They all rode hard toward Crowley's property, the sunrise casting long shadows across the prairie. As they approached, Luke could see what Carter had described. Crowley's ranch house, that ostentatious monument to stolen wealth, had every window shuttered and barricaded. Men with rifles were visible on the roof and at strategic points around the property. Tom and his deputies were positioned behind a row of water troughs about 100 yards from the main house, far enough to be out of easy rifle range, but close enough to watch for any movement.
Tom looked relieved when he saw Luke riding up. Glad you came. This thing's about to go sideways fast. What happened? I tried to serve him with papers from the territorial judge, an official order to appear in Austin for questioning. Crowley took one look at them, pulled a gun on me, and barricaded himself inside. He's got maybe 12 men in there with him, all armed and clearly willing to die for their paychecks. Has he made any demands? Just one. He wants safe passage out of Texas. Says if we let him cross into Mexico, he'll go peacefully. If we try to stop him, he burns the house down and shoots anyone who gets in his way. Luke looked at the house, trying to think. You can't let him run. If he gets to Mexico, I know, he'll disappear, and all those people he hurt will never see justice. Tom rubbed his face. But I also can't risk my deputies' lives storming that place, and I can't sit here and watch him burn it down with his own men inside. So what do you want me to do? Talk to him. You got under his skin at the town meeting. Maybe you can do it again. Maybe you can make him see reason. And if I can't? Tom's silence was answer enough. Luke dismounted and handed his reins to Henderson. Margaret slid down from her horse and moved to stand beside him. I'm going with you, she said before Luke could object. Mrs. Bennett, I really don't think… Tom started. Sheriff, with all due respect, Crowley tried to destroy my family. If anyone has the right to face him, it's me. Tom looked at Luke, who shrugged helplessly. She's not wrong. All right, Tom said, but you both stay behind cover until we know Crowley's willing to talk. Last thing we need is him shooting at civilians. Luke nodded and called out toward the house. Crowley, it's Luke Mercer. I want to talk. For a long moment there was no response. Then a window on the second floor opened slightly and Crowley's voice called back. Come to gloat, Mr. Mercer? Come to give you a chance to end this without anyone dying. How noble of you, but I'm afraid I'm not in a surrendering mood. Then what are you in the mood for? You planning to spend the rest of your life holed up in that house? You planning to shoot it out with federal marshals when they arrive? Because they are coming, Crowley. The territorial judge doesn't take kindly to people ignoring his summons. Let them come. I'll be long gone by then. Where are you going to go? Mexico? You think you can just ride across the border and disappear? You think the people you've stolen from, the families you've destroyed, are going to let you run away? What are they going to do? Chase me? They're farmers and ranchers, not bounty hunters. Margaret stepped forward then, moving out from behind the water trough before Luke could stop her. Mr. Crowley, she called out, do you remember me? A pause. Mrs. Bennett, still running your mouth, I see. No, Mr. Crowley, I'm done running. I spent weeks running from you, running from your hired thug, running from the lies you told and the debts you fabricated. I ran until my horse died and my children nearly died with it. I ran until I had nothing left except the clothes on my back and the love of my family. Is there a point to this story? The point is, I'm not running anymore, and neither is anyone else in Cedar Ridge. You spent years making people afraid of you, years making them believe you were too powerful to fight, but you made a mistake. What mistake was that? You pushed too hard, you hurt too many people, and now they're all standing together against you. The Hendersons, the Jeffersons, Widow Guthrie, Pike and his family, everyone you terrorized and robbed and threatened. They're all ready to testify against you. They're all ready to make sure you pay for what you've done. Testimony won't matter when I'm in Mexico. You're not going to Mexico, Margaret said flatly. You're going to prison, and you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing that you were beaten not by someone richer or more powerful than you, but by ordinary people who refuse to stay silent anymore. Another long silence. Then Crowley laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You think you've won, don't you? You think you've beaten me? Haven't we? Luke called out. No, Mr. Mercer, you haven't won anything. All you've done is destroy yourselves. Because even if I go to prison, even if I lose everything, I'll make sure you lose it too. I still have friends in Austin, friends with power and influence, and I'll spend every day of my sentence making sure your life becomes a living hell. That's where you're wrong, a new voice said. Everyone turned to see Doc Collins riding up with another man, a distinguished-looking gentleman in a dark suit with a silver star pinned to his vest, a federal marshal. The marshal dismounted and walked forward, stopping beside Tom. Mr. Crowley, My name is Marshal James Whitmore. I've been authorized by the territorial judge to take you into custody for questioning regarding charges of fraud, extortion, conspiracy, arson, and about 15 other crimes. You can come out peacefully, or we can come in and get you. Your choice." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Crowley shouted. "Then I'm afraid we have a problem, because I didn't ride 3 days from Austin to go home empty-handed." Whitmore's voice was calm but firm. "And unlike the local authorities, I don't have any personal stake in this community. I don't care about your connections or your money or your threats. I care about upholding the law. And the law says you need to answer for your crimes." "I'm not answering to anyone." "Mr. Crowley, I have 50 federal troops arriving within the hour. They're going to surround this property, and they're going to wait as long as it takes. You can't run, you can't fight your way out, and you can't negotiate. Your only choice is when you come out, now on your own feet, or later in chains after we smoke you out." Luke could see the calculation happening in Crowley's mind, could see him weighing his options, looking for an angle, searching for some way to turn this to his advantage. "I want immunity," Crowley finally called out. "Full immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony against my business partners. There are men in Austin, men with real power, who've been using me as a front for their operations. I give you their names. You let me walk." Whitmore shook his head. "No deals, not until you surrender and not until I see what you have to offer." "Then we're at an impasse." "No, Mr. Crowley, we're at an ending. The only question is how many people get hurt before you accept that." The morning sun was fully up now, painting everything in harsh, unforgiving light. Luke watched the house, watched the windows, trying to read the situation. Crowley was cornered and desperate men did unpredictable things. Then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Children crying. "What the—" Tom started. The front door of Crowley's house opened, and one of his men emerged, dragging 2 small figures. It took Luke a moment to recognize them through his shock and horror. Pike's children. The man had sent his family into town for protection, but somehow Crowley had gotten to them. "Here's my counteroffer, Marshal," Crowley called out. "You give me safe passage to the border, or these children pay for their father's betrayal." Margaret gasped. Luke felt rage flood through him, hot and absolute. Around him he heard Henderson and Jefferson cursing, heard Tom's deputies chambering rounds into their rifles. "You're using children as hostages?" Whitmore's voice was incredulous. "You really have no idea how much worse you're making this for yourself." "I don't care about worse. I care about getting out of here alive." "Let those children go," Luke said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Whatever you do to them, Crowley, I swear to you—" "You'll what, Mr. Mercer? Storm my house? Shoot your way in? How many of your friends die in that fight? How many children catch a stray bullet?" Crowley's voice was manic now, spiraling. "I have nothing left to lose. Nothing. You took my reputation, my business, my future. What more can you threaten me with?" "Your life," Whitmore said flatly. "You hurt those children, and I'll authorize my men to shoot on sight. No warnings, no negotiations. You'll be dead before you take your next breath." "Then we all die together." Luke saw movement in one of the second-floor windows, saw smoke beginning to curl up from inside the house. Crowley was making good on his threat. He was going to burn it all down. "He set the house on fire," Tom said urgently. "We have to get those kids out of there now." "If we rush him, he'll shoot them," Henderson said. "If we wait, they burn," Jefferson countered. Luke's mind was racing, trying to find a solution, some way to save Pike's children without getting everyone killed. And then he saw it, a section of wall on the east side of the house where the boards looked newer, hastily replaced. The same section he'd used to break in and steal the documents from the safe. "I can get in," Luke said quietly. "What?" Tom turned to stare at him. "The east wall. There's a window that doesn't latch properly. I used it before. I can use it again." "Luke, that's suicide. Crowley's men will see you. Not if you create a distraction. Not if you keep Crowley's attention on the front of the house while I go in the back." Margaret grabbed his arm. "No, absolutely not. You'll be killed." "Those children will be killed if I don't try." Luke turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Margaret, I have to do this. I have to." "Why? Why does it have to be you?" "Because I'm the reason Pike turned on Crowley. Because I'm the reason his children are in danger.
Luke's voice broke. And because I couldn't save my own son 5 years ago, maybe I can save someone else's. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. You come back to me. You hear me, Luke Mercer? You come back or I'll never forgive you. Luke kissed her, fierce and desperate and full of love. Then he turned to Whitmore. Give me 5 minutes. Create whatever distraction you can. When you hear me yell, rush the front door. Crowley won't be expecting an attack from 2 directions. Whitmore studied him for a long moment, then nodded. 5 minutes. Make them count. Luke grabbed his rifle and started moving, using the water troughs and outbuildings for cover as he circled toward the east side of the property. Behind him, he heard Whitmore shouting at Crowley, heard Tom joining in, heard the marshal ordering his men into position. The distraction was working. All of Crowley's attention was focused on the front of the house. Luke reached the east wall and found the window exactly as he'd left it, slightly loose, the latch broken. He pulled it open and climbed inside, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. The interior of the house was filling with smoke. Crowley had set multiple fires, and they were spreading fast. Luke pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth and moved quickly through the rooms, searching for where the children were being held. He found them in what looked like a parlor on the first floor. Pike's 2 kids, a boy about Samuel's age and a girl slightly younger, were tied to chairs, crying and coughing from the smoke. One of Crowley's men stood guard over them, his gun drawn. Luke didn't hesitate. He stepped into the doorway and fired. The shot took the guard in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the floor. Luke was on him in seconds, using the rifle butt to knock him unconscious. It's all right, Luke said quickly to the terrified children as he cut their bonds with his knife. I'm here to help. Your father sent me. The house is on fire, the boy sobbed. I know. We're getting out right now. Luke picked up the girl. She couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds, and grabbed the boy's hand. Stay close to me and don't let go. Understand? The boy nodded, his face streaked with tears and soot. They made it 3 steps toward the window before Luke heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy boots. Multiple people. He's inside, someone shouted. There's someone inside. Luke ran. He pushed the children through the window first, practically throwing them outside, then dove through himself just as bullets started tearing through the wall behind him. Now, Luke screamed. Rush the house now. Everything happened at once. Whitmore's men charged the front door. Tom and his deputies came from the side. The smoke was pouring out of every window now, thick and black. And somewhere inside, Luke could hear Crowley screaming orders that no one was following anymore. Luke gathered Pike's children and ran, putting as much distance between them and the burning house as possible. When he finally stopped and turned back, he saw Crowley's men pouring out of the house, coughing and choking, their hands raised in surrender. The marshals tackled them to the ground, slapping on handcuffs with practiced efficiency, but there was no sign of Crowley himself. Where is he? Whitmore demanded, grabbing one of the captured men. Where's Crowley? The man just shook his head, coughing too hard to speak, and then Luke saw him. A figure in one of the second-floor windows, silhouetted against the flames. Crowley stood there, watching his empire burn, watching his men surrender, watching everything he'd built fall apart around him. Crowley, Whitmore shouted, come down. It's over. But Crowley didn't move. He just stood there. And even from this distance, Luke could see the expression on his face. Not fear or anger, but something like resignation. Like a man who'd finally realized he'd lost everything and saw no point in fighting anymore. He's not coming down, Tom said quietly. Then we go up and get him, Whitmore replied. But before anyone could move, there was a sound like thunder. One of the support beams inside the house gave way, and the entire second floor collapsed inward. Flames shot up through the roof, reaching toward the sky. If Crowley screamed, no one heard it over the roar of the fire. They all stood there, frozen, watching the house burn, watching the physical manifestation of Crowley's greed and cruelty turn to ash. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Margaret found Luke in the crowd and threw her arms around him. He held her tight, still clutching Pike's children, all of them shaking from adrenaline and shock and relief. You did it, Margaret whispered against his chest. You saved them. We all did it, Luke said. Everyone who stood up, everyone who refused to back down. We did it together. The fire burned for hours.
By the time it finally died down, there was nothing left of Crowley's ranch house but charred timbers and ash. The marshals searched through the ruins and found human remains. Crowley, presumably, though it would take time to confirm. Tom organized the captured men and prepared to transport them to jail in Cedar Ridge until the marshals could take custody. Whitmore assured everyone that with Pike's testimony and the documents Luke had recovered, there would be enough evidence to convict Crowley's entire organization. The corrupt judges, the bribed officials, the men who'd profited from other people's suffering. Cedar Ridge would finally be free. As the sun climbed toward noon, people started arriving from town. Word had spread about the standoff, and now everyone wanted to see the aftermath. Pike arrived with his wife, and the reunion with his children was tearful and joyful. The man kept trying to thank Luke, but Luke waved him off. "You're the one who had the courage to turn on Crowley," Luke said. "You're the one who risked everything. I just helped finish what you started." Other families arrived too, the Hendersons, the Jeffersons, Widow Guthrie, and her grandchildren, all of them gathering to witness the end of the man who'd terrorized them for so long. There was no celebration exactly. Too many people had been hurt, too much had been lost. But there was relief, and hope, and the beginning of healing. As the crowd began to disperse and people headed back to their own lives and properties, Margaret took Luke's hand. "What happens now?" she asked. Luke looked at her, this brave, beautiful woman who'd run until she couldn't run anymore, who'd stood up to Crowley even when it terrified her, who'd chosen to trust him when she had every reason not to trust anyone. "Now we go home," he said, "and we start building something good." "Just like that?" "Just like that." They rode back to the ranch as the afternoon sun painted the prairie gold. The children were exhausted, drooping in the saddle, but there was peace in their faces that Luke hadn't seen before. Even Rose was almost smiling, though she still didn't speak. When they arrived home, the men who'd been standing guard were already packing up their camps. The crisis was over. There was no more need for sentries and watches and defensive positions. "You need anything? You let us know," Henderson said, shaking Luke's hand. "Anything at all." "Same goes for all of you," Luke replied. "We're neighbors now, real neighbors. That means we look out for each other." After everyone left and the ranch was quiet again, Luke stood on his porch and looked out at his land, his property, his home. For the first time in 5 years, it felt like it truly belonged to him, not haunted by ghosts, not weighed down by grief, but alive and full of possibility. Margaret emerged from the house where she'd been putting the children to bed. She crossed to stand beside him, and they watched the sunset together in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," Margaret finally said. "About what?" "About what you said that first night, about how this house had started breathing again." "I remember." "Well, I think it needs more than just breathing. I think it needs laughter and noise, and maybe some new curtains because the ones in the bedroom are falling apart." She paused. "I think it needs a family." Luke turned to look at her. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "That depends. Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I don't know. Are you?" They stared at each other for a moment, then both burst out laughing. "All right, let me try this properly," Luke said. He took both her hands in his. "Margaret Bennett, I know we haven't known each other long. I know this has all happened fast and probably too soon after both of us lost people we loved. But I also know that you and your children have given me back something I thought was gone forever, the will to live, to fight, to care about tomorrow. And I want 1,000 tomorrows with you. I want to teach Samuel how to ride and help Clara learn to cook and figure out why Rose won't talk. I want to watch Timmy grow up and cause trouble and probably drive us both crazy. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. So what I'm asking is, will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to your children and a husband to you? Will you make this house a home?" Margaret's eyes were shining with tears. "Yes. 1,000 times, yes." They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And from the window above, Luke heard Clara's voice whisper to her siblings, "Mama's going to marry Mr. Mercer," followed by Samuel's excited whoop and even a small giggle that might have been Rose. They were married 2 weeks later in the garden behind the cabin. Doc Collins officiated, since he was the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to an official clergy for occasions like this. Tom stood as Luke's witness, while Widow Guthrie stood for Margaret. Henderson and Jefferson and half the town showed up to watch and celebrate. Clara wore a dress that Mrs. Henderson had made especially for her. Samuel wore his first pair of real shoes, purchased with money Luke had given him for helping around the ranch. Rose carried a basket of wildflowers, and Timmy, dressed in a tiny suit that was already getting dirty, kept trying to catch the chickens that wandered into the ceremony. It wasn't fancy. There was no expensive ceremony, no elaborate decorations, no formal reception with fine foods and music. Just two people who'd been through hell and found each other, standing in a garden surrounded by people who cared about them, promising to build a life together. When Doc asked if there was anyone who objected to the union, 4-year-old Timmy raised his hand. "Yes, Timmy?" Doc asked, trying not to smile. "I object to the chickens. They're being loud." Everyone laughed, and the ceremony continued. Luke slipped a simple silver ring onto Margaret's finger, the same ring Sarah had worn, the one she'd made him promise to give to someone who deserved it. And Margaret gave Luke a ring she'd bought in town with money from selling some of her late husband's tools. Nothing fancy, just a plain gold band, but it meant everything. "You may kiss your bride," Doc finally said. And Luke did, to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered. The celebration lasted into the evening. People brought food and drink. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard. Luke danced with Margaret, then with Clara, then with Rose, who was still silent but smiled the entire time. Samuel tried to dance, but mostly just spun in circles until he got dizzy and fell down laughing. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Luke found himself standing on the porch again, his favorite spot, the place where so much had changed over the past few weeks. Tom joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He passed one to Luke. "Hell of a day," the sheriff said. "Hell of a month, more like." "True enough." Tom sipped his coffee. "Got word from Marshal Whitmore this morning. The territorial judge is moving forward with prosecutions for everyone in Crowley's organization. Could take years to sort it all out, but at least it's happening." "What about the land? All the property Crowley stole?" "Judge is ordering it returned to the original owners where possible. The Hendersons will get their north pasture back. The Jeffersons will receive compensation for their barn. Widow Guthrie's getting her farm back free and clear." Tom paused. "You did good, Luke. You didn't just save your own land, you saved everyone's. I didn't do it alone." "No, but you started it. You had the courage to stand up when everyone else was too scared. That matters." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the party wind down, watching people say their goodbyes and head home to their own families and lives. "Can I ask you something?" Tom said eventually. "Sure." "When you found Mrs. Bennett and her children on that road, when you made the choice to stop instead of riding past, did you know it would lead to all this?" Luke thought about that question. Thought about the man he'd been 3 weeks ago, hollow, going through the motions, barely alive despite still breathing. Thought about the choice he'd made to stop, to help, to care. "No," he said honestly. "I didn't know any of this would happen, but I'm glad it did. Because that day on the road, that wasn't just me saving them. That was them saving me." Tom nodded like he understood. Then he raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Luke echoed. After Tom left and the last of the guests had departed, Luke found Margaret in the kitchen cleaning up. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Leave it," he said. "It can wait until morning." "But there's so much—" "It can wait." Margaret leaned back against him and sighed. "I can't believe this is real, that we're married, that we have a home and the children are safe and Crowley's gone and we don't have to run anymore. It's real." "How do you know? How do you know this isn't just a dream I'm going to wake up from, back on that road with a dead horse and nowhere to go?" Luke turned her around to face him. "Because dreams don't feel this solid. They don't have coffee stains on the counter or chickens pecking at the door or 4 children asleep upstairs. Dreams are perfect, and this—" He gestured around at the messy kitchen, the half-cleaned dishes, the muddy boot prints on the floor. "This is beautifully imperfect. This is real life." Margaret smiled and kissed him. "I love you, Luke Mercer." "I love you too, Margaret Mercer."
That night, lying in bed with Margaret curled against his side, Luke thought about everything that had happened, thought about the day he'd stopped on that dusty road, about carrying a dying woman and 4 terrified children to safety, about opening his home and his heart to people who needed him. He thought about Sarah and Thomas, about the life he'd lost and the years he'd spent trapped in grief. And he realized something important. Loving Margaret and her children didn't mean forgetting Sarah and Thomas. It meant honoring them by choosing to live again, by choosing to love again,
by choosing to build something good out of all that pain. The house was full of sounds now. Timmy snoring in the room that used to be empty. Rose talking in her sleep, actual words, proof that she was healing. Samuel's restless turning as he dreamed whatever dreams 6-year-old boys dream. Clara's steady breathing from the small room she'd claimed as her own, and beside him, Margaret, warm and alive and real. The house breathed, not with the shallow, painful breaths of grief and loss, but with the deep, steady breaths of life and hope and second chances. Luke closed his eyes and for the first time in 5 years slept peacefully through the night. The weeks turned into months, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Clara continued learning to cook and began teaching Rose, who'd started speaking again in small, careful sentences. Samuel became Luke's shadow, following him everywhere and asking endless questions about ranching and horses and anything else that caught his attention. Timmy grew like a weed and developed an alarming talent for getting into places he shouldn't be. Luke taught them all how to ride, how to care for animals, how to work the land. Margaret turned the house into a real home, adding those new curtains she'd wanted, planting a garden that flourished under her care, filling every room with warmth and laughter and love. The town healed too. With Crowley gone and his organization dismantled, Cedar Ridge remembered what it meant to be a community. People helped each other rebuild. Property was restored to its rightful owners. The corrupt officials were removed from office and replaced with honest men and women who actually cared about serving the public. Henderson and Jefferson became regular visitors to Luke's ranch, often bringing their own families for Sunday dinners that stretched into the evening. Widow Guthrie became like a grandmother to the children, spoiling them with sweets and stories about the old days. Even Doc Collins and Sheriff Morrison were frequent guests, though Tom always complained that Margaret's cooking was making him fat. Pike and his family moved to a small farm just outside Cedar Ridge. The man worked hard to rebuild his reputation, and slowly the town forgave him for his past crimes. His children and Margaret's children became fast friends, playing together whenever the families visited. On a warm evening, 6 months after the wedding, Luke stood on his porch watching the sunset. It had become his ritual, this quiet moment at the end of each day, taking stock of all he had, all he'd been given. Margaret joined him, as she always did, and they stood together watching their children play in the yard. Samuel was showing Timmy how to feed the chickens without getting pecked. Rose was reading to Clara from a book Doc Collins had given her. They were happy. They were safe. They were home. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked. "About how lucky I am," Luke said. "About how different my life is now compared to a year ago. About how one choice, one moment of stopping instead of riding past, changed everything." Margaret took his hand. "Do you ever regret it, stopping that day?" "Not for a second. Even with everything that happened, the danger, the fighting, the fear, especially because of all that, because it led us here, to this moment, to this life, to this family." Luke turned to look at her. "You and the children didn't just give me back my life. You gave me back my future. And you gave us a home," Margaret replied. "A real home where we don't have to be afraid anymore. Where my children can grow up safe and loved. Where I can wake up every morning next to someone who sees me, really sees me, and loves me anyway." They stood together as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Stood together as their children laughed and played. Stood together as the house breathed around them, alive and full and whole. Luke thought about that day on the road, about the moment he'd seen those 4 children standing beside their collapsed mother, about the choice he'd made to stop, to help, to care, when it would have been easier to ride away. He'd thought he was saving them. But the truth was, they'd saved him. They'd saved him from a life of emptiness and grief. They'd saved him from the slow death of going through the motions without really living. They'd saved him by reminding him that love was worth the risk of loss, that connection was worth the possibility of pain, that life was worth living even when it was hard.
Thank you, Luke said quietly.
For what? For running, for fighting, for collapsing on that road where I could find you, for giving me a reason to stop. Margaret smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. Thank you for stopping. They stood there as darkness fell, watching the first stars appear in the vast Texas sky. Inside the house, the lamps were being lit. Soon Margaret would call the children in for supper. Soon they'd all gather around the table Luke had once sat at alone, and the house would be filled with conversation and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family life. But for now, in this perfect moment, Luke simply held his wife and watched his children play and felt grateful for every choice that had led him here. He'd stopped for the children on a dusty road, and in doing so, he'd found everything he'd been missing. His house breathed again, his heart beat again, and the life he'd thought was over had only been waiting for the right people to help him begin it anew. The ranch stretched out before them, bathed in the last light of day. The cattle moved slowly toward the water tank. The horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. The chickens settled in for the night. Everything was exactly as it should be. Luke Mercer, rancher, husband, father, stood on his porch and knew with absolute certainty that he was finally, truly home. And it all started the day he stopped for the children, the day he chose compassion over caution, connection over isolation, love over fear, the day everything changed, the day his life began again.